Silas Mercer didn't knock. He never did. He shoved open the door to Nathaniel Crow's barn like he owned the land beneath it, because in his mind he already did. 3 of his men fanned out behind him, boots crunching through the frozen hay, breath clouding in the January cold. Nathaniel was on his knees beside a sick calf, his hands wrapped in bloodied cloth, and he looked up slow, the way a man looks up when he already knows bad news has arrived, wearing a hat. "Heard you sent for a woman," Silas said. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a verdict, mail order, like you're buying seed or fence wire. He let that sit a moment, watching Nathaniel's jaw tighten. Crow, a man who has to beg a stranger to come cook his supper, has already lost. You just haven't admitted it yet. Sign the land over now. Save yourself the embarrassment. Nathaniel said nothing. That was the most dangerous thing he ever did, going quiet. If you've ever been told you weren't worth saving, that your life could be bought and discarded for the right price, stay right here. Because this story is about what happens when a woman nobody believed in walks through a door nobody wanted her to open and refuses to leave. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Evelyn Whitmore in St. Louis. She read it twice, standing at the window of the boarding house on Clement Street. The paper thin enough that the afternoon light came through it and made the handwriting glow like something half-remembered. The letter was not romantic, it was not warm. It was, in fact, almost aggressively practical, 3 short paragraphs describing acreage, livestock numbers, the condition of the cabin, and at the very bottom, in handwriting that slanted left like a man leaning into wind, 2 children. Newborn twins, their mother died in October. I need someone capable. I am not looking for sentiment. Evelyn folded the letter along its original crease and set it on the windowsill. She was 26 years old. She had $43 to her name, a carpet bag that had belonged to her mother, and a reference letter from a woman in Jefferson City who had employed her as a seamstress for 4 years before the shop closed. She had been in St. Louis for 2 months, and in 2 months she had learned that a woman alone with $43 and no family connections was not a person the city was interested in helping. Picked up the letter again. Montana, it said at the top. Blackthorn Ridge. She'd had to ask the woman downstairs where Montana was. The train ride took 4 days, and for the first 2 she sat rigid in her seat, convincing herself she'd made the right choice, and for the last 2 she sat rigid in her seat, trying not to think about whether she had. The landscape changed so completely outside the window that it felt like the country was being replaced piece by piece, the flat Missouri farmland, giving way to rolling hills, then to something wilder and more severe, and finally to the kind of mountains that made her feel like she'd been swallowed. The station at Bitter Creek was not much of a station. It was a platform, a building the size of a large wardrobe, and a man named Haskell who drove a supply wagon and agreed, for 50 cents, to take her out toward Blackthorn Ridge. "You the new bride for Crow?" he asked, not looking at her. "I'm Evelyn Whitmore," she said. He seemed to find that answer neither confirming nor denying anything, and they rode for 2 hours in near silence, through a landscape that was mostly gray sky and snow-covered earth, and the occasional dark line of fencing that appeared and vanished again like a thought half-formed. When he finally stopped and pointed at a track leading off the main road, he said, "That way. About a mile, can't miss it." She looked at the track. It was just a set of wheel ruts in the snow, already half filled by a wind that hadn't stopped blowing since she'd stepped off the train. "You're not taking me further?" Wasn't asked to. She got down from the wagon with her carpet bag, and he turned the horse around before she'd taken 3 steps. The mile was longer than a mile. She knew that when the light started to change, and the wind picked up and she still hadn't seen any building. Her feet were wet through her boots by the time the cabin materialized out of the gray low square, a thin line of smoke coming from the chimney that the wind bent sideways the moment it left the pipe. The barn set back from it, and a fence running at angles to nowhere she could figure, and a dog that raised its head and watched her from the porch steps without getting up. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Hard, the door opened, and the man on the other side was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a beard that needed the same attention, and he was holding an infant against his chest with one arm, the baby wrapped in a piece of gray wool that might have once been a blanket. He looked at her the way people look at a piece of furniture that's been delivered to the wrong house. "Evelyn Whitmore," she said. From St. Louis, I know who you are. Stepped back, and she came inside, and the smell hit her first wood smoke, and something sour underneath it, the smell of a place that had been surviving rather than living. The cabin was one large room, the kitchen and the living and the sleeping, all pressed together with no ceremony about it. Against the far wall, in a wooden crate lined with blankets, a second baby was crying. The first one, the one he was holding, had started crying the moment the cold air came through the door. Nathaniel Crow set the baby he was holding down into the crate with the other one and turned back to her. "You can sleep there," he said, pointing at a cot near the stove. "There's food in the box. The children need feeding every 2 hours. I'll be in the barn." She stared at him. "It's near dark," she said. "The animals don't care about that, Mr. Crow." Nathaniel. He was already pulling on a coat from the hook near the door. "Mister makes it sound like something it isn't." He went out. The door shut. Both babies were crying. Evelyn stood for a moment in the middle of the room with her carpetbag in her hand, listening to the wind work at the gaps in the walls and the twins work at the silence. And then she set her bag down, took off her wet coat, and went to the crate. She had held babies before her sister's children, her neighbor's youngest, the infant that belonged to the woman downstairs in the boarding house, who sometimes asked her to watch the baby while she went to market. She wasn't afraid of babies. What she hadn't expected was how small these two were, how fierce in their unhappiness, how completely and entirely helpless in a way that made the whole frozen landscape outside feel like an abstraction by comparison. She picked up the one nearest to her. A girl, she thought, though it was hard to be certain with the amount of wrapping involved. The baby's face was red and working hard, brows pulled together in an expression of profound grievance. "All right," Evelyn said quietly. "All right, I'm here." The baby did not find this reassuring. But she quieted slightly, or maybe she was just gathering herself for the next attempt, and Evelyn held her and looked around the cabin, cataloging the way her mother had taught her, the way you look at any problem. Start with what you have, not with what you don't. What she had, a stove that was lit and burning reasonably well. A box of provisions that, when she checked, contained dried beans, cornmeal, a small amount of salt pork, some dried apples, and a tin of condensed milk. A stack of wood that would last, she estimated, another day and a half if she was careful. 2 babies, a cot, 4 walls, a door. What she didn't have was enough time to think about what she didn't have. She found a pot, mixed the condensed milk with a small amount of warm water the way she'd seen done, tested it on her wrist, and fed both babies in turn, the way she'd seen that done too, with a piece of clean cloth twisted at the corner. It took a long time, and neither baby was fully satisfied, and both of them communicated this grievance loudly, but eventually the crying settled into the quieter, more resigned sounds of children who'd gotten enough to keep going for a little while. Put them down and went to look at the stove. It was good iron, solid, and the flue seemed to draw well enough. She added wood carefully and checked the damper and stood with her hands held over the surface until the feeling started coming back to her fingers. Then she started dinner. She didn't know when Nathaniel would come back, or if he expected her to wait, or if the silence between them was just how things were going to be. She didn't know much of anything yet about this arrangement except that there were 2 babies who needed feeding, and a stove that needed feeding, and a man somewhere in a barn who hadn't looked at her like a person so much as like a solution to an equation he'd been stuck on. Found a dried apple in the provisions box and ate it, standing at the stove. It tasted like paper. She ate it anyway. Nathaniel came in from the barn 2 hours later, with his boots caked in something she didn't ask about, and his face closed in the way of a man who has been somewhere difficult and intends to keep that difficulty to himself. He stopped when he saw the pot on the stove. He stopped again when he looked at the crate and found both babies sleeping, which they had not been doing, she gathered, with any regularity. He didn't say anything. He sat down at the table and she put a bowl in front of him. And he ate in silence, and she ate at the other end of the table, and the fire popped and the wind pushed at the walls. "They sleep all right," he said finally. "For now." He nodded. He was looking at the bowl. "The cabin's cold," she said. "The gap along the north wall, I could feel it when the wind changed. There's something you could put against it." He looked up. "I know about the gap," he said. "All right, I haven't had time." "I understand." He went back to eating. She watched him, not obviously, the way you watch something you're trying to understand without alerting it. He was younger than his letter had suggested, mid-30s, maybe, though the beard made it difficult to tell. His hands were the hands of someone who worked hard with them, The skin was cracked across the knuckles, and his right forefinger had been broken once and healed at a slight angle. He had not looked at her directly since she'd arrived, not once, and she found she couldn't tell if this was grief or hostility, or just the habit of a person who had been alone long enough that looking at people felt like an intrusion. How did they die? She asked. She hadn't meant to say it quite so directly. It came out that way anyway. He stopped eating. Who? Your wife. The silence lasted long enough that she started to think she'd made a serious error. Then he said flatly, looking at the bowl, fever, to the birth. 3 days. I'm sorry. It was October. He said it like October was a fact to be reported rather than a wound to be acknowledged. Been with me 6 years. What was her name? Another pause, Ruth. Evelyn nodded. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. And somehow that felt like the right thing, not filling the space, not trying to make it smaller, just leaving room for it to be there. After he finished eating, he went to check on the twins and stood over the crate for a long moment that she didn't look at. Then he went to the other side of the cabin, where the real bed was behind a curtain she hadn't noticed before. Just a piece of cloth hung on a rope, and she heard him lie down, and then silence. She sat by the stove until the fire needed feeding. Then she lay down on the cot. She did not sleep for a very long time. The first week was mostly about survival, and mostly about learning. Evelyn learned that the twins, a girl and a boy, both unnamed as of her arrival, a fact she found so startling she had to ask him twice, needed feeding every hour and 40 minutes to 2 hours, and that Nathaniel had been managing this by sleeping in shifts so broken they barely deserved the name, and that he had not been managing it well. The boy was thinner than a baby his age should have been. The girl was better, but not by enough. She learned that the condensed milk was not going to hold them indefinitely, and that Nathaniel had a neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Aldrich, who kept a milk cow 4 miles east, who had agreed to trade milk for fence repair once the weather permitted. She learned that once the weather permits was doing a lot of work in this part of Montana, because the weather was currently doing something that didn't permit much of anything. She learned that Nathaniel woke at 4 in the morning every day without fail, ate whatever was in front of him without comment, and went to the barn, came back at intervals throughout the day that were determined entirely by the livestock and had nothing to do with convenience or warmth, or the fact that his children were inside the cabin. She learned that he was not deliberately cold, he was just a person whose entire attention had been narrowed to the task of keeping things alive through winter, and there was nothing left over for pleasantries. She learned, on the 4th day, that the twins didn't have names because he hadn't been able to decide, and that this was not neglect so much as a man who understood that naming something was a kind of commitment he hadn't been sure he was able to make. You need to name them, she said. It was evening. She'd gotten the boy to sleep and was working on the girl, who had opinions about sleeping that she was making extensively known. Nathaniel looked up from the piece of harness he was mending at the table. I know that. They're 4 months old, I said I know. What were you thinking? She kept her voice even, rocking the baby. Any names come to you? He looked at the harness. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name, not grief exactly, more like the shape of a thought he kept starting and abandoning. Ruth wanted to call the girl Clara. We'd talked about it. Before, Clara's a good name. The boy, he stopped. I don't know about the boy. What was your father's name? He looked up then, actually looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. It was quick, a moment, just a moment, but it was real, and she had the feeling that she'd said something that landed somewhere unexpected. Henry, he said. Henry and Clara Crow, she said. That's solid. That's a name that'll hold. He looked back at the harness, but something had shifted, very slightly, in the set of his shoulders. On the 5th day, Silas Mercer came to call. Evelyn was outside filling the water barrel from the pump that required a specific sideways pressure on the handle, or it wouldn't draw, a fact she'd learned through trial and error, and 3 failed attempts when she heard the horses. 4 of them, coming up the track at a pace that suggested the riders had somewhere more important to be, which was a strange attitude to bring to a visit. She knew who Silas Mercer was because Nathaniel had mentioned him, once in the context of the land to the west. He's been after that parcel for 2 years, Nathaniel had said. Every time I have a bad season, he shows up to make an offer. He'd said it the way you mention weather, as a fact of the landscape rather than a grievance. Mercer was a big man, heavy across the chest, with a face that had probably once been handsome and had since organized itself around the confidence of someone who hadn't been told no enough times. He rode a horse that was considerably better than anything Evelyn had seen in this part of the territory. His men fanned out behind him with the practiced ease of people who were used to fanning out. He looked at Evelyn the way she'd been looked at in train stations, as an inconvenience, as a piece of furniture, as something to be moved around rather than spoken to. "Where's Crow?" he said. "I'll get him," she said. "You the mail order woman?" She stopped, turned back, looked at him with the kind of steadiness she'd had to learn over years, because it hadn't come naturally. "I'm Evelyn Whitmore, Mr. Crow's wife." She went inside and told Nathaniel he had company, and then she stood near the stove and listened through the gap in the door while Mercer made his offer again, the parcel to the west, a number that she didn't know how to evaluate, but that Mercer delivered with the tone of someone doing a tremendous favor. And while Nathaniel told him, in fewer words than she'd have used, that the land wasn't for sale. "Crow," Mercer said, and his voice had changed, taken on a weight that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite not one. "You've got 2 babies and a stranger running your kitchen, and the worst winter in 12 years coming. Be sensible." "I am being sensible," Nathaniel said. "Good day, Silas." Then the horses moved, then they were gone. Nathaniel came inside and stood near the door for a moment. He didn't look at her. "He'll come back," she said. "He always comes back." "How much is that parcel worth?" he told her. She did the math quickly, the way she'd learned to do math in the years, when every dollar had to stretch in 3 directions. And she understood immediately why Mercer wanted it and why Nathaniel couldn't sell it. "The northern grazing land," she said. He looked at her. "How did you lose the north parcel? You lose 1/3 of your summer range." She stopped, recalculated. "That's the difference between surviving and not, this far from town." He stared at her for a moment that went on a half beat too long. He said, "It is." He went back to the barn. She stood at the stove and thought about Silas Mercer's face when he'd looked at her, that particular kind of dismissal that came so automatically to certain men that they didn't even notice they were doing it. She'd seen it before. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant he'd already decided she wasn't worth accounting for. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she disagreed. The second week, she fixed the gap in the north wall. She found what she needed in the barn strips of oiled leather, an old rawhide that Nathaniel had cut from a worn harness, and she spent a morning working it into the gap from the inside while both twins slept. They did with the unpredictable generosity of infants who'd decided for a day to cooperate. The wind stopped coming through. The temperature on the north side of the cabin, when she held her hand against the wall that evening, was noticeably better. Nathaniel noticed. He didn't say anything, but she saw him check the wall when he came in from the barn, running his fingers along the joint, and the fact that he checked without comment meant he had registered it. She also started working on the food situation, which was becoming urgent. Provisions box was getting thin. She found a recipe for something that could be made with cornmeal and dried apple that she didn't have a name for, but that Nathaniel ate without complaint, which she'd come to understand was a form of approval. Stretched the salt pork in ways that would have impressed her mother, who'd had a talent for making something from less than enough. It was on the 9th day that Clara smiled for the first time. Evelyn was holding her, just sitting by the stove in the afternoon light that came through the single window in a way that made the whole cabin feel, for a moment, less like survival and more like living. And Clara looked up at her with the unfocused absolute attention of a 4-month-old, and then her face rearranged itself into something that wasn't exactly a smile yet, but was clearly its precursor, a kind of opening. Evelyn made a sound she hadn't planned. Nathaniel was at the table. He looked up. She smiled, Evelyn said. She felt foolish immediately after saying it, but she said this anyway because it seemed like something that needed to be said aloud. Nathaniel crossed the cabin in 4 steps and stood over them and looked down. And Clara, as if performing for the suddenly larger audience, did it again, that opening in her face, that beginning of a smile. Nathaniel Crow put his hand over his mouth. He stood there for a moment with his hand over his mouth and his eyes bright with something Evelyn looked away from, because it felt private. Because it was private, and then he cleared his throat and said, roughly, "Henry's going to want to know what she gets to do, that he doesn't," and went back to the table. Evelyn looked down at Clara. Clara had already lost interest and was examining her own fist with great seriousness. "You're right," Evelyn told her quietly. "It's a very good fist." The first real confrontation with the town happened on a Thursday. Nathaniel had to make a supply run. They were out of several things that couldn't be improvised, including lamp oil and a particular medicine he needed for one of the calves, and he brought Evelyn because the twins couldn't be left alone and the wagon had room. She hadn't been in town since she arrived, and town, she was now learning, was the settlement of Harrow Creek, which had a general store, a church, a blacksmith, and the particular social ecosystem of a place where everyone knew everyone's business because there wasn't enough business to go around. She felt the looks immediately. She'd expected them a new woman, brought in the way Nathaniel had brought her in, was going to be looked at. That was the nature of small places. What she hadn't expected was the particular quality of the looking, which wasn't just curious but was almost combative, as if her presence was a claim they hadn't agreed to. The women at the dry goods counter were polite in the way that costs something: precise smiles, careful words, questions that were really a kind of inventory. Where had she come from? What family did she have? How long had she and Nathaniel known each other before the arrangement? She answered them honestly. St. Louis, no family to speak of. They had corresponded. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Pullman, who appeared to be a person of significant local authority, had looked at her over the edge of her reading spectacles and said, "Nathaniel Crow is a good man. He's had a difficult year." It sounded like a warning. He has, Evelyn agreed. Ruth Crow was well regarded in this community. She's missed. I imagine she is. Mrs. Pullman studied her for another moment, then began wrapping the goods without further comment. But the message had been delivered. Evelyn had understood it. The message was, "You are on probation." It was Silas Mercer who made it worse. He came into the store while they were still there, with one of his men, and he stopped when he saw Evelyn, and he smiled the way people smile when they're about to say something they've been saving for the right audience. "Crow," he said to Nathaniel, who had just come in from the back with the lamp oil. "Didn't know you'd brought her to town." "Good to meet you properly, miss." "Mrs. Crow," Evelyn said. Mercer's smile widened. He looked at Nathaniel. "She's settling in all right? Must be quite a change from—" He paused, as if searching for the word. "Wherever she came from." "City girl, is that right?" "St. Louis," Evelyn said. She kept her voice level. "St. Louis." He shook his head slowly, as if St. Louis were a condition to be sympathized with. Long way to come for a hard life. He looked at Nathaniel again, pointedly ignoring her. "You sure you know what you're doing, Crow? No offense to the lady, but a mail-order arrangement isn't exactly—" "That's enough," Nathaniel said. Mercer looked at him. His smile didn't disappear exactly, but it settled into something less performative and more watchful. "I'm just saying what people are thinking." "You're saying what you're thinking," Nathaniel said, "and I'd appreciate you keeping it to yourself." He looked at Mrs. Pullman, who was studying the counter with great attention. "Is there anything else we need, Evelyn?" There was something in the way he said her name. Not warmth exactly. Nathaniel Crow was not a man given to warmth in public, or in private for that matter. But it was a claim. It put her on his side of the line, clearly and without ambiguity, and everyone in the store heard it. "No," she said. "I think we have what we came for." They left. The ride back was mostly silent, which was how most of their time together was, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Something had been stated. She wasn't sure exactly what it meant, but she knew it meant something. When they got back, both babies were awake and very unhappy about it. Picked up Henry. Nathaniel picked up Clara. They fed them, in silence, on opposite sides of the crate, and Clara fell asleep first and Henry took longer, as he always did, and the stove popped, and the wind was starting to find the cracks it always found. And eventually Henry gave it up too, and they set both children down, and Nathaniel stood and stretched his back and said, without looking at her, "I should have said something the first time he came. Before you got here." She didn't answer right away. "You said something today," she said finally. He made a sound that might have been agreement. He put his coat back on and went out to the barn, and she stood by the stove and felt something she didn't have a name for yet: not safety, not comfort, nothing as certain as either of those. More like the sense of standing on ground that might, over time, turn out to be solid. She'd had less to work with before. She added wood to the fire and checked on Henry and Clara and started thinking about dinner. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, and the sky, when she checked through the window, had taken on the heavy yellow-gray color she'd learned, in the weeks since her arrival, to pay close attention to. That sky meant weather was coming. What she didn't know yet was how much. The yellow-gray sky that Evelyn had noticed through the window held off for 3 more days, which was long enough to make her wonder if she'd read it wrong. And then on the 4th morning she woke before dawn to a sound she hadn't heard before: a low, sustained moan from somewhere in the structure of the cabin itself, the kind of sound wood makes when something large and cold is pressing against it from outside. She lay still on the cot and listened. The twins were quiet. Fire had burned down to coals. The moan came again, and this time the whole north wall seemed to breathe inward slightly. Just a fraction. Just enough to tell her that whatever was outside had weight to it. She got up and added wood to the stove before she did anything else, because the temperature in the cabin had dropped enough that her breath showed, and the twins couldn't afford that. Then she went to the window and looked out. White. Just white in every direction, falling sideways. Nathaniel was already in the barn. He could tell because the barn door had been opened and closed. Recently, the snow in front of it was scuffed and tracked, and there was a light moving behind the gap in the boards. She pulled on her coat and her boots, which she'd started keeping near the stove so they'd be warm in the mornings. A small adjustment that had made more difference than she'd expected, and she went to check on the animals. The barn was warmer than the cabin, which surprised her the first time, and didn't surprise her anymore. 12 cattle and 4 horses produced heat in a way that no stove could quite replicate, and Nathaniel had packed hay along the north side of the barn in a way that cut the wind before it reached the animals. He was crouched near the far stall when she came in, and he looked up and then looked back at what he was doing, which was checking the hoof of a horse that was not cooperating. "Bad one coming," she said. "Yes. How long do you think?" "Could be a day. Could be 3. He stood, and the horse shifted, and he put one hand on its neck without looking at it, the automatic gesture of a man who'd spent more of his life around horses than people. "I've got enough hay in here if I'm careful. The cattle are the problem. 3 of the calves are too young for hard cold." She looked at the calves in the near pen. They were small, younger than she'd realized, actually born late in the season, in a way that would make this winter harder on them. "What do they need? To not freeze." "I can see that." I mean, specifically, he looked at her. It was still the considering look, the one that was trying to figure out what she was, and why she kept asking questions that turned out not to be foolish, and she'd gotten used to it enough that she just waited it out. They need the temperature to stay above a certain point, and they need their mother's clothes. If the temperature drops fast and the mothers get stressed, calves stop nursing, and then you lose them inside a day. "What's the lowest temperature you've seen in this barn during a bad storm?" He told her a number that made her do some quick arithmetic in her head. Then she went back to the cabin. She spent the next 2 hours doing something that she'd explain to him later. When he came in for the midday break and found her standing on a chair, pushing hay into the gaps along the cabin's north-facing wall, not the interior gaps she'd already sealed with leather, but the exterior eave, the overhang, where the wind had room to build up and push. "What are you doing?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Insulating." She climbed down. "If the hay blocks the wind at the eave, the wall holds more heat. It won't be enough for the cabin, but the barn's more important anyway. I was thinking about the barn." He looked at the work she'd done. Then at her, the barn's made different. The hay there would need to be against the outer wall, north and west faces, packed tight and high enough to break the wind before it reaches the boards. You'd need to brace it so the weight doesn't cause problems. She said it quickly, because she'd been working through the geometry of it while she was up on the chair. "Do you have enough hay?" There was a pause. "Barely," he said. "Then we should do it before the storm gets worse." They did it that afternoon together, which was the first time they'd worked alongside each other at something physical rather than just dividing the tasks of the household. It was harder than she'd anticipated, and the wind was already picking up enough to make the work miserable. And she slipped once on the ice near the barn door and caught herself on the frame, hard enough to bruise her palm, and Nathaniel reached out instinctively to grab her arm and then let go immediately, the way you let go of something you've touched without meaning to. "I'm all right," she said. "The ice gets worse near the door." "The animals," he stopped. "Just watch where you step." They finished before dark barely and went inside, and she fed the twins, and he ate what she'd kept warm on the stove, and neither of them said much. But the hay wall was there. She'd know by morning whether it made a difference. By morning she knew. The storm had come in properly overnight, not the worst she'd see that winter, but enough to test things. And the barn temperature, when Nathaniel checked it at 4 in the morning and then told her at breakfast without her having to ask, was holding better than it had in the last storm. Not perfectly, but better. He said this looking at the table as he said most things. But he said it. She decided that was enough for now. What she hadn't anticipated was Mrs. Aldrich. The widow was 60 years old and had opinions, which she shared freely and without apparent concern for whether they were welcome. She arrived on a clear day in late January on a horse that was too big for her and tied it to the fence post with the easy authority of a woman who had been tying horses to things for 5 decades, and she knocked on the cabin door with the handle of her walking stick. Evelyn opened it. Mrs. Aldrich looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone who had long since stopped pretending she wasn't looking. "You're the one from St. Louis," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Thinner than I expected. She came inside without being invited. This was apparently just how she moved through the world. She looked at the twins in their crate, and something shifted in her face. Something that was almost tenderness, though it moved through quickly. "Ruth's babies. Lord, they've grown. They're doing well," Evelyn said. Mrs. Aldrich sat down at the table as if she'd sat at it 100 times, which Evelyn would later learn she more or less had. "Where's Nathaniel, Barn?" "I can get him in a minute." "Sit down, I want to look at you." Evelyn sat down. She didn't have a particular feeling about being looked at by Mrs. Aldrich. It felt different from the way people in Harrow Creek looked at her. Less like judgment, and more like assessment, like someone figuring out what a tool was made of before deciding whether to use it. "You sealed that north wall," Mrs. Aldrich said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And the hay around the barn?" "Yes." "Nathaniel wouldn't have thought of the hay. He knows his land and his animals. The hay was just geometry." Mrs. Aldrich studied her for another moment. "You've had a hard life." "I've had a life," Evelyn said. "Parts of it have been harder than others." "What happened to you?" "Before." Evelyn had prepared for this question in various forms, had thought about it on the train, and in the first nights on the cot when she couldn't sleep. She'd decided that the answer she gave would depend on who was asking and why. She looked at Mrs. Aldrich and decided this was a person who wanted the true version. "I was engaged," she said, 3 years ago. The man had a business that failed and he left. Before the wedding, she paused, after he'd taken most of what I'd saved. Mrs. Aldrich made a sound low in her throat that managed to convey a great deal without constituting a word. "My family wasn't." Evelyn stopped and started again. "My mother had died the year before. My father was not someone who could help. I found work. It wasn't enough work for long enough. And then I saw Nathaniel's letter, and she looked at the twins. It seemed like a situation where someone was needed. I'm good at being useful. That's a sad reason to come to Montana. Maybe. But I'm here." She met Mrs. Aldrich's eyes. "And the children are better than they were." Mrs. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Silas Mercer's been talking." Evelyn felt something settle in her stomach. "What's he saying?" "That Nathaniel's lost his grip on things. That bringing in an unknown woman is evidence of poor judgment. That the ranch is one bad season from going under, and the sensible thing." Mrs. Aldrich cut herself off. "You understand what he's working toward. He wants the north parcel. He wants the whole ranch. The north parcel is how he gets started." She stood up, straightening with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had opinions about cold weather. "Nathaniel needs to be careful. Mercer's got a lawyer in Billings. He's been asking questions about the original deed." That was new. Evelyn kept her face still while she filed it away. "Does Nathaniel know this?" "I'm telling you, because I think you're someone who does something with information." She looked at her steadily. "Nathaniel is a good man. He works hard, and he's honest, and he's been so buried in grief this past year that I'm afraid he hasn't noticed what's been building around him." She moved toward the door. "Don't let him miss it." She left without waiting for Nathaniel. Evelyn sat at the table after she was gone, listening to Henry make small sounds of displeasure at being awake, and finding no one paying attention to him, and she thought about lawyers and deeds, and the particular kind of danger that comes from the direction you're not looking. Picked up Henry. He was indignant for a moment and then settled against her shoulder with the abrupt equanimity of infants who have decided to accept the world as they find it. "All right," she said quietly. "We need to think." She didn't tell Nathaniel that same evening. She waited 2 days turning it over, because she'd learned enough about him by now to know that timing mattered, that there were moments when he could hear things, and moments when the information arrived at the wrong door and bounced back harder than it had gone in. She told him on a Sunday morning, when the weather had cleared and the cabin was warmer than usual, and both twins had slept through a longer stretch than normal, which meant Nathaniel had slept too, for the first time in what felt like weeks, and he came to breakfast looking, if not rested exactly, then at least less like a man being actively worn down by degrees. She said, "Mrs. Aldrich told me something when she came." "About Silas Mercer." He looked up from his coffee. She told him what Mrs. Aldrich had said, the lawyer, the deed, the questions being asked. She said it straight, without editorializing, because she'd found that was the way he received things best. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he put his cup down carefully. "The deed is clean. he said. I believe you, but if someone is asking questions about it, clean or not, you need to know the questions they're asking. My father filed that deed himself. In 1869. Is there a copy? He frowned. Originals and Billings County Records. Is there a copy here or in your papers? There was a pause, not the kind that meant he was hiding something, but the kind that meant he was searching his memory and not immediately finding what he was looking for, which was, in its own way, the answer. He said, Then we need to find out. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite anger, more like the discomfort of a person who has been good at certain things and is being asked to reckon with the things they haven't attended to. Good at ranching, at animals, at land in the physical sense. The paper world of deeds and county records and lawyers and Billings was a different kind of territory, and she could see that he knew it. My father kept papers in a box, he said finally. In the loft. I haven't looked at it since he died. Maybe we should. They found the box that afternoon, a wooden crate with a fitted lid, packed with papers in the careful, slightly obsessive way of a man who hadn't trusted banks or institutions, but had trusted documentation. Evelyn went through it methodically while Nathaniel stood nearby, doing the thing he did when he was uncomfortable with a situation, which was pretending to be occupied with something adjacent to it. She sorted the papers into categories she made up as she went: land documents, financial records, correspondence, miscellaneous. The deed was there, a copy handwritten, carefully preserved between two pieces of oilcloth that his father had clearly put there with the intention of keeping it safe. She spread it on the table and read it, and then read it again, and then found what she was looking for, a description of the northern boundary that was specific enough to be important. There's a surveyor's marker referenced here, she said. Stone marker at the northwest corner. Do you know where it is? Nathaniel came to look at the document. He read it with the focused attention of a man reading something for the first time that he thought he already knew. There's a stone out there. I always assumed it was a field rock. I never thought about what it marked. If that marker's been moved. It's a rock, he said. It weighs 300 pounds. People have moved heavier things when there's enough money involved. She looked at him. We need to know that stone is where this paper says it is. He looked at the document for a long moment. Then he said, with the particular reluctance of a man who does not enjoy being wrong, I'll check it tomorrow. The stone was where it was supposed to be. Came back from checking it the next morning, stomping snow off his boots at the door, and said so, adding, in the way he added most things that cost him something to admit, that he'd measured the distance from it to the fence line he'd put in 3 years ago, and the fence was about 4 feet short of where the deed said the boundary was. 4 feet of ground, in the open land of the Montana frontier, was not a number that sounded significant until you thought about what lay on the other side of it. What's 4 feet in that section? She asked. Access to the creek. He said it flatly. The winter watering point for the north herd. She let that sit for a moment. So if someone were to make a case that your fence line was the property line, I lose the creek access. He sat down. He had the look of a man who had stepped on a stone he'd been walking past for 3 years. The north herd needs that water in winter. Without it, you'd have to move them or find another source. Which in winter? There isn't one, he said. Not in range. The fire popped. Henry, who had been doing something complicated with his own fingers, made a sound of dissatisfaction. Clara slept through all of it with the supreme indifference she'd already developed as a personality trait. Nathaniel, Evelyn said carefully, this is not a man making empty threats. He has a lawyer who's asking questions about your deed, and you have a fence line that doesn't match the deed. And if he files something in Billings, I know. His voice was short. Not at her, she'd gotten better at distinguishing the different kinds of short that came from him. This one was directed inward. I should have checked the fence when I put it in. I measured from the wrong point. You were building fence, not fighting a lawsuit. Same thing out here. He rubbed his face with bones, the gesture of a man scrubbing something that won't come clean. What do I do? It was the first time he had asked her that question directly. She registered it and set the reaction aside to look at later. Move the fence, she said, as soon as the ground permits. Get it exactly where the deed says it should be, and document that you've done it. She paused. And write to the county clerk in Billings. Ask for a formal copy of the deed record. There's a discrepancy in what's on file versus what you have here. You need to know about it before Mercer's lawyer does. He looked at her. You know about deeds and county clerks, he said. I know about men who take things from people who aren't paying attention. She said it without heat, as a simple statement of experience. I've watched it happen. The mechanism is always the same. Find the gap, work the gap, make the gap look like the whole picture. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, who took something from you? She looked at him. He was looking back, actually looking with the directness that he brought to things he was serious about. She hadn't talked to him about anything from before. He hadn't asked. This was the first time. A man I trusted, she said. Doesn't matter now. It matters if it's why you're here. I'm here because this is where I am. She stood up and went to check on Henry, who had given up on his fingers and was now looking at the ceiling with the profound attention he gave to things that interested him. And right now, what matters is keeping it that way. She didn't look back at Nathaniel when she said it, but she heard him shift in his chair, and she heard something in the quality of the silence that followed that felt different from the silences she'd been cataloging since she arrived. February arrived with a brief warmth that was almost cruel in the way it suggested spring before snatching the suggestion back. And during those few mild days, Evelyn did two things that she'd been planning since December. The first was to start teaching herself what she needed to know about the ranch, not the way Nathaniel ran it, which she was already learning by proximity, but the parts he hadn't told her yet, because he hadn't thought she needed to know them. She asked him questions during the midday breaks, when he came in for coffee, and she could pin him to the table for 15 minutes before the animals or the weather or his general restlessness pulled him back out. She asked about the cattle, which animals were, what the breeding record showed, what the plan had been before Ruth died, and the plan fell apart. She asked about the pasture rotation and the winter grazing schedule and what he'd done differently last year when prices dropped. He answered. Slowly at first, with the air of someone who wasn't sure why the information was being requested, and then with more detail, because she asked follow-up questions that were specific enough to show she was actually tracking what he'd said and not just performing interest. By the third week, she had a rough picture of the ranch in her head that was beginning to feel like something she could work with. The second thing she did was make a friend. Hattie Greer was 22 years old and had been married to a farmer named Doss Greer for 2 years, and she lived on a claim 4 miles south with a baby of her own and a cheerfulness that was partly constitution and partly, Evelyn suspected, the deliberate policy of someone who'd decided that cheerfulness was what was going to get her through. She came over on a Wednesday with a pot of something that turned out to be a very good bean soup and stayed for 3 hours and talked the entire time in a way that Evelyn found genuinely restoring after weeks of Nathaniel's functional silence. Hattie told her about everyone in Harrow Creek. Not maliciously, she didn't appear to have a malicious bone in her, which was either a gift or a limitation depending on the situation. She told her who was trustworthy and who wasn't, and who was somewhere in between, which was most people. She told her that Mrs. Pullman at the dry goods store was harder to win over than she seemed, but that once she decided in your favor, she stayed there. She told her that the Reverend Aldous, whose church she did not need to attend if she didn't want to, kept to himself and didn't cause problems. She told her about Silas Mercer with the careful precision of someone who wanted to be informative without being overheard. He bought out the Harmon claim. 2 years ago, Hattie said, lowering her voice slightly, even though they were alone in the cabin with 2 infants and a sleeping baby. The Harmons had a bad season, and Silas made an offer that looked fair until you looked at the back of the paper. My Doss knew them, said they didn't understand what they were signing. She paused. He does that. Makes things look reasonable until they're not. Has he done anything that wasn't legal? Evelyn asked. Hattie thought about it. Not that anyone could prove. The Harmons didn't think they'd sold the water rights until they tried to use them the following spring. She looked at Evelyn steadily. He's patient. That's the thing about him. He'll wait years for the right moment. Evelyn thought about a fence line 4 feet short of where it needed to be. I know the type, she said. March brought mud, which was its own kind of problem, the tracks becoming impassable, the barn floor needing constant management, the livestock restless with the change in the air. That meant spring was theoretically possible, even if it was taking its time arriving. Henry had developed the ability to grab things, and the judgment not to let go of them, which kept Evelyn occupied in new ways. Clara had started watching people's mouths when they talked, with an intensity that suggested she was cataloging information for future use. Nathaniel had written to Billings. The response came in mid-March, a formal copy of the deed record, which matched the copy in the oilcloth perfectly, and a note from the county clerk that there had been an inquiry regarding the property the previous October. 3 months before Mercer had showed up at the barn door making his offer. Nathaniel set the letter on the table and looked at it. He was planning this before winter, he said. Before you were weakest, Evelyn said. That's how it works. He was quiet. She watched the information settle into him, watched him revise his picture of what was happening and what had been happening, the way you revise a map when you discover a road you hadn't marked. He thought the winter would do it for him. Nathaniel said slowly. Calves died if the supply got low enough. A man in enough trouble sells things he wouldn't otherwise sell. She paused. He probably assumed a man grieving, alone with 2 infants, would have a different winter than you had. Nathaniel looked at her. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. He picked up the letter, folded it, and put it with the copy of the deed in the wooden crate. Then he went to check on the twins, which he did every time something moved him in a direction he didn't want to examine too closely. Clara was awake. She grabbed his finger the moment he put his hand near her, with the same decisiveness she brought to most things, and held on. He stood there for a moment, letting her, looking down at her with the expression that came on his face. Sometimes when he thought no one was watching, not soft exactly, but open, careful openness of someone who has been hurt badly enough that they've learned to be very intentional about what they let themselves feel. Evelyn went to stir the pot on the stove and let him have the moment. The mud season brought something else she hadn't anticipated. Nathaniel talking, not about important things at first. It started with the cattle he'd come in from a long morning and say something about one of the animals, a behavior he'd noticed, a problem he was working through, and then keep talking while she finished making coffee or checking on the twins, as if the words had been stored up somewhere and the habit of keeping them back was loosening. She listened without making a lot of it, because she'd learned that making a lot of things with Nathaniel had a tendency to make those things stop. He talked about his father, who had built the original cabin and had been a man of strong opinions and moderate luck. He talked about the land, not the legal dimensions of it that they'd been dealing with, but the land itself, the way it changed through the seasons, the places he'd found water, and the places where the grazing was better than it looked. He talked about horses in a way that made it clear. Horses were the thing he'd been closest to for most of his life, including most of the time he'd been a child. One evening, late, after the twins had gone down and the fire was banked, and she was mending one of Henry's blankets by lamplight, he said. Without preamble, Ruth didn't like the winters. Kept her eyes on the mending. No, she tried. It wasn't that she couldn't manage it. She was capable. She was very capable. He was looking at the fire. But she'd come from somewhere warmer, and the dark months wore on her. By February, she'd get quiet in a way that wasn't like her, and I never knew quite what to do with it. Did you ask her? Once he paused. She said she just needed spring, and she'd be all right by April, and she always was. He stopped. Fire popped. She didn't make it to April. Evelyn finished the stitch she was on and cut the thread. She didn't look at him. She sounds like someone who kept going, even when it was hard, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. I used to think when you came I thought it would feel like I was... He stopped again, and she waited, and he said quietly, it doesn't feel like that. What you do here, it doesn't feel like replacing anything. She looked up then. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and his face had the slightly unguarded quality it only took on in these late, still moments when the twins were asleep and the work of the day was finished. Good, she said simply, it's not meant to. He nodded slowly. She went back to the mending. Outside, the mud was beginning to freeze again as the temperature dropped, which meant tomorrow would be difficult in its own particular ways. She'd learned to track these cycles, the brief warm, the mud, the refreeze, the tentative thaw again, the whole grinding machinery of a Montana winter, grinding its way toward spring. She'd learned to plan around them, to adjust, to take what each day offered. It was, she thought, not so different from other kinds of adjusting. Henry made a sound in his sleep, not crying. Just the small sounds of a baby, dreaming something that required commentary, and both she and Nathaniel looked over at the same moment and then looked back at what they'd been doing. It was a small thing, an ordinary thing, but it was the kind of ordinary thing that Evelyn, lying awake later on the cot, turned over carefully in the dark. Outside, the wind was building again. She could hear it, finding the north wall, testing the leather she'd worked into the gaps, back in those first days. Back when she'd been cataloging what she had and what she didn't. She'd had less to work with then. She had more now. Question of what Silas Mercer would do next. And when was one she hadn't stopped thinking about. The mild weather would make the roads passable. The The lawyer in Billings would send correspondence. Somewhere in the machinery of that patient, careful plan, something was going to move. She'd been watching for it. She kept watching. The letter from Billings arrived on a Tuesday in late March, and it was not the one they'd been waiting for. Nathaniel was in the north pasture, checking the fence line, the real fence line, the one he'd been moving in sections since the ground softened enough to work, 4 feet at a time, driving new posts with the particular grim focus of a man correcting a mistake that had been waiting to be corrected when Hattie Greer came by on her way from town and left a bundle of mail with Evelyn. Most of it was the usual: a seed catalog that was already out of date, a notice from the county about road maintenance fees, a letter for Nathaniel from a cattle buyer in Great Falls, and then at the bottom of the bundle, a cream-colored envelope with the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. Evelyn set everything else on the table and held the law firm's letter in both hands for a moment without opening it. She knew what it probably was. She'd been expecting some version of it since February, since the county clerk's note about the inquiry in October, since the morning she'd understood that Silas Mercer's patience was not a personality trait, but a strategy. Knowing it was coming didn't make holding it feel better. Put it back on the table, in the center, where Nathaniel would see it the moment he came in. Came in at noon, boots caked with the gray clay mud of the north field, and he saw it. Stopped. He looked at it with the expression of a man who recognizes the shape of bad news before he's read a word of it. When did this come? This morning. Hattie brought it. He picked it up, broke the seal with his thumb, and read it standing at the table. She watched his face. He was not a person whose face gave a great deal away, but she'd been studying it long enough now to read the tension that came around his eyes when something was landing badly. He set the letter on the table. "They've filed a claim," he said, "against the property boundary. Mercer's lawyer says the surveyor's record in Billings shows the northwest marker at a different position than what our deed describes." He paused. "They're saying our copy is an error." "An error," she repeated. "A transcription error, from when the deed was recorded." He said it the way you say something that you know is a lie, and know you can't simply say is a lie. They want a county surveyor to come out and verify the marker's position. And if the county surveyor agrees with their reading, the boundary moves, we lose the creek access. He sat down. He sat down the way people sit when their legs have decided not to hold them through the full weight of the moment. "I've been out there, I measured. The marker is exactly where our deed says it is. Then the county surveyor should confirm that. The county surveyor is Lyle Dempsey." He said the name with a particular flatness that communicated everything she needed to know. "He's done work for Mercer before. Twice." Evelyn looked at the letter. Then she looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at the table with the expression she'd come to understand meant he was doing the kind of accounting that had nothing to do with money, the accounting of a man who is measuring what he has against what is, being asked of it and finding the numbers difficult. "We need someone else," she said. "A different surveyor." "That costs money, I don't. Mrs. Aldrich might know someone. Or there may be a federal land officer." If the original filing was made under federal homestead provisions, she stopped, reached for the copy of the deed from the wooden crate where they'd been keeping it, and spread it on the table. She'd read it enough times, now that she knew it nearly by memory. Here, the original survey was conducted under territorial authority in the 1869. There's a federal record. There might be. He looked at the document. My father talked about the Territorial Land Office. He was particular about it. He went twice to make sure the filing was complete. Then there's a federal record of the original survey, independent of the county clerk's record. She looked at him. If those two records agree, and they agree with what you have here, Mercer's lawyer has nothing. He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about federal land records?" "I spent 4 years as a seamstress in Jefferson City," she said. "The woman who owned the shop had a dispute with her neighbor about a right-of-way. I helped her write the letters." She paused. "I read a great deal in that shop. There wasn't always much else to do." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, not quite surprise. Something between the two. "You read about land law," he said. "I read about most things." She folded the deed back along its crease. "I'll write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. You should also write to the county clerk and tell them you dispute the claim and that you're seeking an independent survey. Put it in writing and send it before they have a chance to schedule Dempsey's visit." He was quiet for a moment. Clara was making her thoughtful sounds, the ones she made when she was awake and processing the world, and Henry was asleep with the thoroughness of someone who has decided that sleeping is the correct response to any situation. Evelyn, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. I should tell you. He stopped, started again. When I wrote that letter, the one that brought you here, I was thinking about the children, about the winter. He looked at his hands on the table. I wasn't thinking about what it would mean to bring someone into this, what it was asking. I knew what I was coming to, she said. I read your letter. You knew what I told you. I didn't tell you about Mercer, or the fence line, or he gestured vaguely in a way that encompassed the whole of what they'd been managing. I didn't tell you it was complicated. Everything's complicated, she said. I didn't expect otherwise. Most people would have left. I'm not most people, she said it simply without drama, and I'm not going to leave. So let's write the letters. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he got up and found paper, and they sat across from each other at the table, and she drafted the letter to Helena while he wrote to the county clerk, and the twins made their various small sounds around them. And outside the mud of late March was doing what mud did, which was making everything harder and more possible at the same time. Response from Helena took 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Nathaniel finished moving the fence. He did it alone, mostly, in the gray pre-spring weather that couldn't quite decide if it was getting warmer or not, and Evelyn watched him from the window. Sometimes the methodical work of it, the new posts going in straight, the wire being strung with the care of a man who understood that this fence line was no longer just a boundary marker, but a document, evidence of tension and right, something that would need to hold up to scrutiny. She also, in those 3 weeks, went to town twice. The first trip was with Nathaniel for supplies, and it was largely unremarkable except that Mrs. Pullman, at the dry goods counter, had looked at her differently than before, less like an inconvenience to be managed, and more like a person whose presence had been registered and tentatively accepted. She'd asked Evelyn how the twins were doing. Not in the pointed way she'd asked before, but in the ordinary way of a woman asking about children she had some mild interest in. It was a small thing. Evelyn noted it. The second trip she made alone on a borrowed horse from Mrs. Aldrich, while Hattie Greer stayed at the cabin with the twins for the afternoon. She went to see a man named Colfax who had a small office above the hardware store and who was not, strictly speaking, a lawyer, but who had studied law for 2 years in Ohio before circumstances had brought him to Montana, and who advised people on legal matters in an unofficial capacity that everyone in Harrow Creek treated as official enough for practical purposes. Colfax was a small man with a large opinion of careful thinking, and when she laid out the situation for him, the deed, the fence line, the law firm's letter, the county surveyor's connection to Mercer, he listened without interrupting, which was a quality she found immediately reassuring. The question, he said when she finished, is whether the federal record supersedes the county record in a boundary dispute. Does it? In territorial filings from the 1860s and early 70s, generally yes. The federal surveyor's plat is considered the foundational document. He looked at the copy of the deed she'd brought. If you can get the territorial plat from Helena, and if it agrees with this, he tapped the paper. Mercer's claim dies in front of any judge who isn't in his pocket. Is there a judge in this county who isn't in his pocket? Colfax looked at her over the copy of the deed. Not especially. But there are judges in Helena who aren't, and a federal land dispute gets kicked to federal jurisdiction if either party requests it. How does one request that? He told her. She listened carefully and asked 2 follow-up questions, and then thanked him, and rode back to the ranch in the thinning afternoon light, the cold coming back with the dark the way it always did. Still, even in late March, even when the days had started to stretch. She told Nathaniel that evening after dinner, while the twins were in that brief window of cooperative quiet that came sometimes in the early evening when they'd eaten and weren't yet tired enough to complain about it. He listened. He asked one question: if we request federal jurisdiction, does it delay things? Colfax thinks 6 to 8 months before a hearing. He absorbed that. That's through summer, which means Mercer can't do anything binding through summer. She paused. His leverage is the winter. He needs you weak and pressed. A federal filing takes away his timeline. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He got up and went to look out the window, which was something he did when he was thinking through, something that had physical dimensions, as if looking at the land helped him think about it. If we file federal, he said, not turning around, he'll know we're not folding. He might push harder. He's going to push harder anyway. We should make sure he's pushing against something solid. Turned around. He looked at her with the look she'd cataloged as the one where he'd made a decision and was just confirming it. Write the letter, he said. The response from Helena arrived on a Wednesday in mid-April. It was not the territorial plat itself that would take longer. They'd been told but a letter from the Federal Land Office confirming that a record existed for the Crow Property Survey of 1,869, that it was on file, and that a certified copy could be obtained upon request with the appropriate fee. There was also a note, brief and bureaucratic, acknowledging receipt of the request for federal jurisdiction review. Nathaniel held the letter and read it twice. It exists, he said. Exists, Evelyn agreed. He set the letter down, and for a moment he just stood there in the middle of the cabin, and the look on his face was one she hadn't seen before, something close to relief. But cautious. The relief of someone who has been carrying a weight and has just been told there's a chance they might be able to set it down, though not quite yet. Henry chose this moment to roll over for the first time. He'd been on the blanket on the floor, which was where he spent his supervised time on the ground, working very seriously on the problem of mobility in the way he worked on all problems with a focused, slightly indignant determination, and then suddenly he was on his stomach, looking as startled as a baby can look, which is significantly startled. Evelyn made a sound. Nathaniel looked. Clara, nearby in the crate, appeared entirely unimpressed. He rolled, Evelyn said. I see that. Henry, having recovered from his surprise, appeared to be reconsidering the whole enterprise. Nathaniel crouched down and looked at him. Henry looked back with the wide-eyed, slightly accusatory expression that was his default. Nathaniel made the same sound Henry made when he was deciding something, and Henry's face shifted in the way it did sometimes a recognition, something familiar in the sound, and he made it back. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the blanket. She didn't say anything. She just watched them, the man and the boy, talking in sounds that weren't words yet and didn't need to be. Outside, the spring was finally arriving in earnest, the mud beginning to firm. The first green, coming back into the south-facing hillsides, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt that was for now, and if they had anything to say about it, still theirs. Spring did not soften Silas Mercer. If anything, it sharpened him. He came to the ranch in early May, this time alone, no men fanned out behind him, no performance of force. Just him on his good horse, riding up the track with the unhurried confidence of someone who has decided to try a different approach. Evelyn saw him coming from the window and went to the door. He didn't look surprised to see her. He pulled up at the fence and looked at her from the saddle. Mrs. Crow, he said. The title came out with a particular inflection she didn't like. Mr. Mercer. Nathaniel around? He'll be back from the North Field shortly. You're welcome to wait, she said it in the tone of someone for whom hospitality is an ingrained habit that she's choosing to deploy, rather than something she actually feels. I can get you coffee. He swung down from the horse and tied it and came to the porch. Up close, he was more tired than she'd expected, not physically, but in the way of someone who has been managing a great many things and has found some of them more resistant than anticipated. He took the coffee she brought and sat on the porch step in a way that was almost informal, as if he'd decided to try the version of himself that was just a neighbor. You've been busy, he said, writing letters. We've been managing our affairs, she said. Federal jurisdiction's an expensive business. He looked out toward the North Field. And slow, we're patient. He was quiet for a moment. Then I want you to understand something. This isn't personal. The land has a value that Nathaniel isn't. He's not in a position to develop it the way it should be. That creek excess, the north parcel, I could run 3 times the cattle on that range that he can. It's his land, Evelyn said. It's land that could be used better. By your measure, she kept her voice even. You don't get to decide what someone else does with their own property, Mr. Mercer, just because you do it differently. He looked at her then, really looked for the first time, with something that wasn't dismissal. It was still not respect, not quite, but it was something more than he'd been bringing to these interactions. Assessment, maybe. A recalibration. You're not what I expected, he said. Most people aren't. Nathaniel came back from the North Field 20 minutes later, and the conversation between the two men was short, and correct Mercer had come. She suspected, to feel out whether the federal filing had made them nervous or resolute, and Nathaniel, who had been briefed by Evelyn on this possibility before Mercer arrived, gave him resolute in a quantity that didn't require elaboration. Mercer left without getting what he'd come for. Nathaniel watched him ride down the track. He's not done, he said. No, Evelyn agreed. But he's recalculating. What happened next arrived not from the direction of lawyers and land records, but from the weather, which was Montana's most reliable way of reminding you that it didn't care about your plans. Storm came in the second week of May with a speed and severity that belonged to November. Evelyn saw it the way she'd learned to see weather, not through prediction, but through the specific quality of the air, the way the temperature had dropped 12 degrees in 4 hours during the afternoon, the way the horses in the barn had gone restless, in the way they went restless when something large was coming. She told Nathaniel at supper. He went outside to look and came back inside and said 3 words, "Get the wood." They spent the next 2 hours moving every piece of firewood that was stacked outside the barn into the barn and the cabin, until the stack inside the cabin was taller than Evelyn, and the stack inside the barn was pressing against the wall. Nathaniel also brought in the 2 youngest calves from the north pen. They were old enough now to be weaned, but not old enough for a hard freeze, and the temperature was doing something that suggested hard freeze was exactly where it was headed. The calves were not happy about being inside the cabin. Twins were not happy about the calves. The calves were afraid of the twins. It was a complicated 40 minutes. "They can't stay in here," Nathaniel said, looking at a calf that had decided to investigate Henry's blanket with more enthusiasm than the situation called for. "They can go in the barn if we can keep the temperature up," Evelyn said. She was already thinking about it, running the geometry she'd run before how much heat a certain number of animals generated, how much the hay walls held in, whether the new hay she'd added in March was enough. "I'll go back out and let me check the barn first." She went to the barn with a lantern, in the wind that was already starting, and did what she'd done that first winter, measured with her hands, checked the gaps, felt where the cold was coming in. The hay walls on the north and west faces were still mostly intact. The issue was going to be the roof she'd noticed in March, that one section of the north corner had lost some of its insulating material, and she hadn't done anything about it because the cold season had seemed to be ending. She went back inside. "The barn will hold if we add material to the north corner of the roof. But someone has to go up." Nathaniel was already pulling his coat back on. "I'll do it. The wind, I know the roof." He looked at her. "Stay with the children." She wanted to argue. She had the argument ready. The wind was too strong. The roof was icy. The calves could survive a degree or 2 lower than they'd previously assumed. But she also knew that he was right about knowing the roof, and she knew that someone needed to be with Henry and Clara, and she knew that this was the version of the partnership, where she took the part she was better positioned for and trusted him with the part he was better positioned for. "Be careful," she said. He went out. The next hour was one of the longer hours she could remember. She kept the stove fed, kept the twins calm. Henry had picked up on the tension in the way babies picked up on everything, with his whole body, and was fussing in a way that required actual management, and listened to the wind that was doing things that sounded structural. Cabin held. The leather-sealed gaps held. The wood in the stove burned steady. Nathaniel came back in with ice in his beard and a cut on his right hand from where he'd slipped on the roof edge and caught himself on a nail. "It's done," he said. She got warm water and cleaned the cut without asking. He let her. It wasn't a bad cut. She'd seen bad cuts, had dealt with a few in her years of useful necessity, but it needed to be cleaned properly and wrapped, and she did it the way she did most things, with attention and without ceremony. "Did you slip?" she said. "A little." "How far?" "Caught myself." He was watching her wrap his hand. "The nail stopped me." "The nail also cut you." "Better than the alternative." She tied off the bandage and looked at his hand, and then at him, and he was looking at her with the careful attention he'd been bringing to her more frequently, the kind of attention that had a weight to it that she'd been choosing not to examine. "Thank you," he said. "Don't go back up there tonight." "I wasn't planning to." The storm lasted 2 days. Bad, not the worst either of them had seen, but bad enough, the kind of storm that froze what it touched and kept the world contracted to the walls of wherever you were. They were inside together for 2 days with the twins and the 2 calves, who were eventually moved to a corner of the cabin near the stove, in a penned-off section that Nathaniel made from 2 crates and a piece of board, and who were significantly better behaved once they'd adjusted to their temporary situation. On the first night, after the twins were down and the calves had settled, Nathaniel told her about the year his father died. He told her in pieces, the way he told everything, without a clear beginning, or the kind of narrative shape that a deliberate storyteller would bring to it. He'd been 24. His mother had been gone since he was 8. The ranch had come to him in a condition that was not exactly prosperous. The previous years had been hard. The cattle numbers were down. The equipment was outdated. Spent the first 3 years just keeping it from sliding further. "How did you manage?" she asked. "I didn't know I wasn't managing." He said it without bitterness. "I thought that was what it was supposed to feel like. Just keeping your hands on the thing so it doesn't fall." He paused. And then Ruth came. Evelyn listened. She was different from anyone I'd known. He was looking at the banked coals. She made things that were hard seem not easier. Exactly. But worth it. The hard parts didn't feel pointless when she was here. He was quiet for a moment. When she died, I thought that was gone. That particular feeling of it being worth something. The wind pressed at the cabin. One of the calves shifted and settled. And now, Evelyn said. She said it carefully, not sure she should say it at all. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then it's different. It's not the same thing. But he stopped. Tried again. I noticed things again. The way I did before she got sick. I noticed the land and what's growing and when something's working. He paused again. And other things. She didn't ask what other things. She should have. She knew the way you know things you're not quite ready to act on. What he meant. But there was a pace to this that felt important to respect. And she was not, in any of her calculations, a person who forced conclusions before they were ready. Get some sleep, she said. The calves will need checking before dawn. He looked at her. There was something in his face that was part frustration and part something she couldn't name that made her look away. Yes, he said. All right. She lay down on the cot and listened to the wind. Storm cleared on the third day, and the damage assessment was better than it could have been, and worse than they'd hoped, which was roughly the summary of most things. 3 fence posts in the south field had given way. A section of the barn roof had lost material despite Nathaniel's work, and 2 of the older cattle had moved through the gap in the fence before morning and found the creek, which was still theirs to find, and needed to be retrieved. Calves were fine. The young ones, the ones that couldn't have managed the temperature outside, had come through the 2 days in the cabin with the uncomplicated resilience of young animals that have been kept warm enough, and when Nathaniel moved them back to the barn, they went with the slightly offended dignity of creatures returning to proper accommodations. The twins were fine. Better than fine, Henry had somehow found the storm, 2 days of tremendous entertainment, and had spent most of them in a state of stimulated alertness that Evelyn suspected would eventually turn into the personality of a person who found difficulty interesting. Clara had slept through a remarkable percentage of it and appeared to have emerged recharged. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the cabin on the 3rd morning, looking at the clearing sky, and did her accounting. What they had, what they'd used, what needed doing. The answer to what needed doing was a long list, but it was a list that had an end, and things with ends were manageable. Behind her, Nathaniel was making coffee. He'd started doing this sometime in March, making coffee in the mornings, leaving her cup on the table at the place where she always sat. It was a small thing. He'd never mentioned doing it, and she'd never mentioned noticing it. She came inside and sat down and picked up the cup. The south fence first, she said. South fence first, he agreed. They drank their coffee. Outside, a meadowlark had started somewhere, the first one she'd heard since she'd arrived in Montana, and the sound of it was so unexpectedly bright against the white and gray of the morning that she stopped mid-thought and just listened. In Jefferson City, a meadowlark in spring had meant the same thing it meant here, that the worst of it was behind you, that what was coming, whatever it was, would at least have warmth in it. Nathaniel was watching her. She could feel it, the way you feel something when you've become attuned to where a person is in a room. Meadowlark, she said. First of the year, he said. She nodded. She put down the cup and stood up and went to put on her coat, because there was a fence to repair and calves to check, and a letter to write to Helena following up on the territorial plat, and the day was not going to manage itself. Nathaniel was still watching her when she turned around. What, she said. Nothing. He looked at his cup. Stopped. She waited. Nothing, he said again. But it wasn't the same nothing as before. It was a nothing that was full of something he hadn't decided yet how to say. She pulled on her coat and picked up her gloves. The pair she'd worn through 6 weeks of Montana winter until the leather at the left thumb had cracked, and she'd repaired it with a strip of harness leather in a patch that was ugly and functional, and she'd stopped noticing. Come on then, she said. He got his coat, and they went out into the first spring morning that actually felt like spring, and the meadowlark was still singing somewhere in the brush, and the mud was beginning to dry at the edges. And there was, for the first time, real warmth in the sun when it hit her face. She did not allow herself to think too far ahead. That was a rule she'd kept since St. Louis, since the boarding house on Clement Street, since the $43, and the letter on thin paper, you don't think too far ahead, because too far ahead is where the things you can't control live, and it doesn't help to visit them early. But the meadowlark was real. The warmth was real. The man walking beside her through the mud of the south field, his hands already reaching for the fence post before they'd fully arrived at it, was real. What was between them was real too. Even unnamed, even unclaimed, even sitting there in the mornings between two coffee cups on a table in a cabin that still smelled of wood smoke in winter and the specific aliveness of children and animals that had been kept warm through. Kind of cold that didn't care about any of it. Evelyn reached the fence post and tested it with both hands. It had gone over but not broken. It could be reset. Driven back in, the wire retightened. She held it upright while Nathaniel positioned the driver, and the rhythm of the work was easy by now. The way two people move together when they've learned each other's timing without making a project of it. Something was coming. She could feel it the way she'd felt the storm, not through a single signal but through the accumulation of small things that added up to a condition that required attention. The federal plat would arrive. Mercer would move again. The summer would bring its own demands and tests. She held the post and felt the ground shake with each blow, and held steady and didn't let go. The territorial plat arrived from Helena on a Friday morning in the last week of May, and it was everything Colfax had said it might be, and one thing more. Evelyn was the one who opened it. Nathaniel was in the south field, finishing the last section of fence that the storm had taken down, and she'd been watching for the mail carrier since Tuesday, when the window for delivery had opened based on how long the Helena office had said the certified copy would take. When she heard the horse on the track, she was already moving toward the door. The envelope was large, official, heavy with the kind of paper that government documents were printed on, the kind that said, by its very weight, that it intended to be taken seriously. She brought it inside, set it on the table, and opened it carefully, the way you open something you've been waiting on, with the particular focus of a person who doesn't want to miss anything. The plat itself was a surveyor's, drawing the original from 1869, copied and certified by the Territorial Land Office, with a stamp and two signatures. It showed the Crow property in its original dimensions, the boundaries marked with compass bearings and distances, the northwest corner marked with a symbol that corresponded, in the surveyor's legend at the bottom, to a permanent stone marker. She read the bearing and distance from the northwest corner to the nearest creek edge. Then she read it again. Then she put the plat down flat on the table and went to the wooden crate and got the copy of the deed and opened it and compared the two documents side by side, running her finger along the numbers. They matched. Every measurement, every bearing, every distance, the 1,869 territorial plat and the deed copy from the oilcloth agreed completely, down to the fraction. But that was not the one thing more. The one thing more was a note, handwritten, on a separate sheet of paper, from the land office clerk, clipped to the back of the plat. It read, in the careful bureaucratic language of someone who was being precise because precision mattered, please be advised that this office received a request for information regarding this property survey in October of last year, from a representative of Mercer Land Holdings. The requesting party was informed that the official survey record was on permanent file and could not be altered or reinterpreted without a federal court order. This office notes this for your records. She sat down. October. The same month, the county clerk had received an inquiry. Mercer had gone to both the county and the federal office in October, trying to find a gap, and the federal office had told him there was none, and he'd proceeded anyway with the county approach, knowing the county surveyor was someone he could work with, hoping they could manufacture a discrepancy before anyone checked the federal record. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel came in. He saw her face before he saw the documents. "What is it?" he said. Pushed the plat across the table. He read it, then the note. She watched him read the note twice. He already knew, Nathaniel said. His voice was very flat. He knew in October that the federal record would hold. He went to the county because he thought he could work around it. And if we hadn't, he stopped. If we hadn't written to Helena and filed for federal jurisdiction and sent these letters. She didn't finish it either, because the end of the sentence was obvious and unpleasant. Nathaniel set the note down. He stood very still for a moment, and the quality of his stillness was different from his usual stillness, less like someone thinking, and more like someone working very hard to stay where they were and not do anything that would feel good in the short term and be useless in the long one. He knew it was wrong, Nathaniel said, the whole time. He knew the claim was wrong, and he filed it anyway. Yes, he picked up the note again, put it down. That's not a mistake. That's not a different reading of the evidence. He made it up. He made enough of it up to cause trouble, and hoped the trouble would be cheaper than the fight. She looked at him. It wasn't. He walked to the window and stood there. Henry was on his blanket on the floor behind him, doing his daily work on the problem of mobility, and Clara was in the crate making sounds that suggested opinions, and the ordinary life of the cabin continued, around the weight of what they'd just understood. "What do we do with this?" Nathaniel said. "We take it to Colfax. He writes to Mercer's lawyer with both documents, the plat and the note." She paused. "When a federal land office puts in writing that they told the opposing party the claim had no basis, and the opposing party filed anyway, that's not just a losing case. That's potentially a fraudulent filing." He turned around. Colfax will know what can be done. But Mercer has to know the moment he sees this note that he's not in a negotiating position anymore. She paused. He's in a position where he needs this to go away quietly. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something he'd never said before. In those words, in that order, "I don't know what I would have done without you here." She looked at the plat on the table. "You would have figured it out." Not in time, he said it without self-pity, just as a fact. Not before he'd done enough damage. He looked at her. "You knew what to ask for, and who to ask, and how to read what came back. I wouldn't have—" He stopped. "I'm not saying I'm helpless. I'm saying you saw things I didn't see." "You saw things I didn't see either," she said. "That's how it works." He was quiet. She could feel the conversation standing at a threshold that they'd been standing near for weeks, near enough to feel the shape of it, not quite at the point of crossing. Henry chose this moment to roll very determinedly into the leg of the table. The table did not move. Henry expressed his feelings about this. Both Nathaniel and Evelyn moved toward him at the same time, and arrived at the same time, and crouched down at the same time to check on him, and found themselves close enough together that there was a moment brief, just a moment where the distance between them was not the careful, managed distance they'd been maintaining. Henry was fine, indignant but fine. He grabbed Nathaniel's finger with his usual conviction and held on. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn over Henry's head. She stood up and said, "I'll get dinner started," and went to the stove, and neither of them said anything more about the moment or what had been standing at the threshold of the conversation. But it was there. It had been said in the way things get said without words, and she thought about it while she stirred the pot and listened to Nathaniel talk to Henry in the low rumbling way he'd developed for the twins. Not quite words, not quite not words. Something in between that the babies responded to with a seriousness that suggested they were gathering meaning from it, whether it was there or not. They went to see Colfax the following Monday. Hattie Greer took the twins again. She'd become the unofficial solution to the problem of twins plus necessary errands, arriving with her own baby on her hip and a cheerfulness that seemed genuinely inexhaustible, though Evelyn suspected it had a cost that Hattie just didn't show. They rode to town together, Nathaniel and Evelyn, on the two horses, the road finally dry enough to be navigable, without the mud problem that had characterized March and April. It was the first time they'd ridden to town together, without an urgent supply need driving it, and the difference in quality was noticeable. She had time to look at things, to see what the land was doing in late May, which was considerable. The south-facing slopes were green now. The creek was still running high, but starting to settle, and somewhere in the brush, the meadowlark she'd heard that first spring morning was still singing, or a different one was, and she'd stopped trying to tell the difference. Colfax read both documents slowly. He read the note from the land office twice, in the way of a man making absolutely certain he was reading what he thought he was reading, and then he set them down on his desk and looked at them for a moment in silence. "This is better than I expected," he said. "What can be done with it?" Nathaniel asked. "Can be done." Colfax leaned back. "In the first instance, we write to Mercer's attorney of record and transmit copies of both documents with a demand to withdraw the claim. We note that we are in possession of evidence that the filing party had prior knowledge that the federal survey record contradicted their claim." He paused. "Any attorney worth his fee will see immediately what that means for his client. If he doesn't withdraw, then we take it to the federal circuit. With this note, with the plat, with the documented correspondence, you win. Not probably win." When he looked at Nathaniel. "But Mercer knows that too. If he has any sense, and any attorney worth keeping will tell him so the moment he reads this." "How long to write the letter?" Evelyn asked. "I can have it ready by Wednesday. You'll want to review it before it goes." "Yes," Evelyn said. "We'll come back Wednesday." Colfax looked at her and then at Nathaniel. He'd been doing this the whole conversation, registering who was tracking the argument and who was tracking the emotional weight. of it, which was its own kind of information about a partnership. He was a careful enough man to notice things, and careful enough not to say everything he noticed. This was good work, he said. Both the Helena filing and keeping the deed copy. A lot of people don't have the deed copy. Her, Nathaniel said without hesitation. She found the deed copy. Colfax nodded. Well, come back Wednesday. They left his office and walked out into the main street of Harrow Creek, which was busy in the way it was busy in late May wagons, horses, the particular commerce of a small frontier town gearing up for a summer that had to do the work of paying for a winter. Mrs. Pullman was outside the dry goods store, arranging something in the window. She saw them and raised a hand in a greeting that was for Mrs. Pullman, almost effusive. Nathaniel raised his hand back. Evelyn nodded. She thawed, Evelyn said quietly once they were past. He was looking at the street. You should know people have been talking. She kept her pace even. About what specifically? He seemed to be choosing words with more care than usual. About the letters we sent. To the county. People know we've been pushing back on Mercer's claim. He paused. Mrs. Pullman told Mrs. Aldrich that it was about time someone stood up to him. Apparently there's a feeling. There's always a feeling, she said. People feel things for a long time before they say them. Well, they're saying them now. He glanced at her sideways. About you specifically. She didn't say anything. That you're the reason we're still standing, he said. He said it looking straight ahead, the way he said things that cost him. That's what Hattie told me. And Mrs. Aldrich said something similar. I'm one reason among several. She looked at the road. You moved the fence. You went to the roof in that storm. Kept this ranch going through a year that would have broken most people. Not without both, she said. It's both. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It isn't one person doing the thing while the other watches. Both. He was quiet for a moment. They reached the horses and he untied his and held it, and she untied hers. And he said, looking at his horse's neck, I know what I said in that letter. The one that brought you here. I know what it sounded like. It sounded like a man in a difficult position being honest about what he needed. It sounded like I was ordering something from a catalog. She almost laughed. The almost law surprised her enough that she didn't quite complete it. I knew what I was responding to, she said. I wasn't under any illusions about what the letter was. He looked up from the horse's neck. Why did you come? She'd thought about this question many times, in many forms, in the months since she'd arrived. She'd thought about it on the cot, in the early dark, and while feeding the twins at 3 a.m, and while patching the north wall, and while sorting through the papers in the wooden crate, and while writing letters to Helena, and learning about feed schedules, and holding fence posts in the May mud. I wanted somewhere that needed me to be useful, she said. I was good at being useful, and I didn't have anywhere to be useful. She paused. And I thought that might be enough to start with. Was it? She looked at him. He was looking at her directly, the way he looked at things he needed to see clearly. It turned into more than that, she said. You know it did. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod that meant he'd received something and was not going to perform anything around it. Just take it in and keep it. They rode back to the ranch. Colfax's letter went out on Wednesday, as promised, and the response from Mercer's attorney arrived in 12 days, which was faster than any of them had expected. Claim was being withdrawn. There was no apology in the letter, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no language that admitted anything that could later be used against Mercer in any proceeding. It was clean and short and written in the voice of someone who had been told, very clearly, that the path forward had walls on both sides, and had decided that retreat was the only option that didn't lead somewhere worse. Claim was withdrawn. The county surveyor's visit was canceled. The matter was, as far as Mercer's attorney was concerned, concluded. Nathaniel read the letter at the table with the same stillness he'd brought to the plat and the land office note, and then he set it down and looked at it for a moment. That's it, he said. That's it, Evelyn said. The alternative was a federal proceeding where the evidence showed he'd known the claim was fraudulent before he filed it. She paused. His attorney would have explained the options. He was quiet. She understood the quality of the quiet it was. The quiet of someone who has been braced for a fight for a long time and has found the fight is over, and the body doesn't quite believe it yet, still holding the tension that doesn't have anywhere to go. I want to send a copy of the withdrawal to Mrs. Aldrich, she said, and to Colfax. So there's a record that it was formally withdrawn. Good. He pushed back from the table and stood up. He was restless, she'd learned. When things resolved, he needed to do something physical, or the energy had nowhere to go. He went to the window, looked out, came back. The north fence is finished. Creek access is clean. Yes, I can get 60 head through the north pasture this summer if the grass holds. It should hold. We've been giving it the east rotation. He looked at her. You've been thinking about the summer grazing. I think about everything, she said. That's how I'm built. He almost smiled. She'd seen this almost smile enough times now to know it was the version he gave when something actually reached him, not the polite expression he'd sometimes produce when courtesy required it, but the real one, the one that started in his eyes before it got anywhere near his mouth. Calves from the winter, the two we brought inside, he said. They're going to be good animals. The little bull, especially. I know. I've been watching him. You've been watching the cattle. I watch everything, she said it simply. It's useful to watch. He sat back down. He picked up the withdrawal letter and looked at it again. And this time she had the sense that he was seeing through it rather than reading it, looking past the document to what it meant, which was summer without the weight of the land claim, which was the north pasture without that particular fear attached to it, which was a future that had, in the past few months, become something he could actually see. My father built this place, he said. He started with 40 head and a quarter of what we have now, and he spent 30 years making it into something. He set the letter down. I used to think about him when things were hard. That first year after he died. I'd think he managed worse than this with less. He paused. This winter I didn't think about him as much. What did you think about? She asked. He looked at her. You know what I thought about, he said. She held his gaze. The cabin was very quiet. The twins were sleeping, both of them, at the same time, which happened rarely enough to feel like a kind of grace when it did. Outside, the summer was arriving in earnest, warm and green and loud with birds. Nathaniel, she started. I know I'm not. He stopped. I know this is complicated. What I brought you into. What it started as. He looked at the table. I know that what I wrote in that letter was not. Stop apologizing for the letter, she said. You've apologized for it 3 different times, and I've told you 3 times it doesn't need apologizing for. She kept her voice even but direct. I'm here. I know why I'm here, and I know what it's become, and I know. She stopped herself. Say it, he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the patient, serious attention he gave to things he'd decided were worth being patient and serious about. I know what I want it to be, she said. He was very still. I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I don't expect you to. Evelyn. He said her name the way he'd said it that day in the dry goods store in Harrow Creek, when he'd put her on his side of the line in front of everyone, with a weight to it. I'm not trying to figure out what I owe you. I'm trying to tell you what this is. He looked at her steadily. What this has been. For a while. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Henry stirred in his sleep and settled. Clara, who slept like a person who has decided that sleeping is the correct allocation of resources for the current situation, didn't move. All right, Evelyn said. All right, he said back. It wasn't declaration. It wasn't a moment of the kind she'd read about in the novels she'd found in various places during her years of useful necessity. Nothing swept, nothing certain, nothing without the roughness of real things that have been arrived at through work and mistake and the ordinary passage of difficult time. But it was real, in the way that the fence posts were real, and the plat was real, and the withdrawal letter was real. Something that existed, that had been confirmed, that would hold. June brought Hattie Greer's husband Doss to the ranch, with 2 days of labor, and a set of opinions about fence construction that were at odds with how Nathaniel had been doing it, and the resulting argument, conducted largely in the field, with neither man quite willing to concede, but both men willing to try the other's method, when they thought the other wasn't watching, resulted in a section of fence that was genuinely better than either of them would have built alone. Evelyn watched this from a distance with something close to amusement. She also, that June, had a conversation with Mrs. Aldrich that she thought about for a long time afterward. The older woman had come by on a Wednesday with a jar of something preserved, and the horse that was too big for her, and had stayed for the better part of the afternoon in the way that Mrs. Aldrich stayed for things fully, without apology, with opinions distributed at regular intervals. She'd held Clara, who permitted this with the regal condescension she brought to most physical handling, and she'd talked with Evelyn about the land claim resolution, and about the summer plans, and about Harrow Creek in the way she talked about it, which was with the comprehensive knowledge of someone who had lived in a place long enough to know where all the soft spots were. At the end of the afternoon, when she was preparing to leave, she said, I knew Ruth. Evelyn looked at her. We weren't close. Different women, different ways. She was fastening her riding jacket with the careful deliberation of someone whose fingers worked better than she let on. But I knew her well enough. She was a good woman. She loved him in this place. She looked at Evelyn steadily. She would not have wanted him to stop. I know, Evelyn said. I'm not sure you do entirely. Not in the way I mean, Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with the frank assessment she'd brought to their first meeting. There are people who would say, and some of them have that you're taking something, moving into a space that belongs to someone else. She paused. I want you to know that's not what I see. What do you see? I see a woman who came to a broken place and put her hands on it and held it together. She picked up her riding gloves. That's not taking. That's building. There's a difference. And most people know it when they see it, even if they're slow to say so. Evelyn thought about Ruth, about the woman that she knew only through the absence she'd left, through a name said quietly in the dark, through a curtain on a rope and a daughter named for what Ruth had wanted, through the grief of a man who had learned, slowly, painfully, to let grief be what it was without making it into a wall. Thank you, she said. Mrs. Aldrich made the sound she made when something was understood and didn't need more words. Then she left, and the sound of the horse on the track faded, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched the summer afternoon do its long, slow, golden thing over the land. The middle of June brought a heat that dried the mud into something close to hardness and made the north pasture into exactly what Nathaniel had said. It would be good grass, deep creek access, 60 said, moving through it with the unhurried contentment of cattle that have been given what they need. Evelyn went out there one morning early, while Nathaniel was still in the south field, and the twins were with Hattie. She rode to the northwest corner of the property and found the stone marker, the 300-pound granite rock that had sat in that spot since before any of them were born, that Mercer's lawyer had tried to make negotiable with paper and legal language, that had remained exactly where it was supposed to be throughout all of it. Put her hand on it. It was warm already from the morning sun. Solid and permanent in the way that certain things were, the way the federal plat was permanent, the way the creek was permanent. Running 20 feet from the marker in the direction the 1,869 surveyor had recorded with his compass and his careful notation. She sat on the stone for a while. She thought about St. Louis, about the boarding house on Clement Street, about the letter on thin paper that she'd read twice at the window in the afternoon light. She thought about the train ride and the 4 days of persuading herself in both directions, and Haskell's wagon, and the mile that was longer than a mile in snow that was already half filling the wheel ruts. She thought about the moment she'd opened the door of the cabin, that first time the cold coming in, 2 babies crying, a man looking at her like a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong house. That felt very far away. It was also, in another sense, very close the same woman, the same hands that had packed the leather into the north wall and stirred the pot and written the letters to Helena, the same $43 in a carpet bag, and the stubborn conviction that usefulness was enough to start with. It had been enough, and then it had become more than enough, which was not something she'd planned on, but which had happened anyway, the way things happened when you stayed somewhere long enough to let them. She heard a horse coming and looked up. Nathaniel came through the north gate and rode toward her, and he looked at her sitting on the marker stone, with the expressions that she'd catalogued most recently as the one he didn't try to manage, the one that was just what it was, without the careful guardedness that had been his default when she'd arrived. "What are you doing out here?" he said. He wasn't asking, because it was strange. He was asking the way people ask things they already know part of the answer to. Thinking, she said. He pulled up and looked at the stone, then at her. About how far things travel. She stood up. From where they started to where they end up. He dismounted in the easy way of someone who has spent most of his life getting on and off horses and stood beside her at the marker. He looked at the creek, running bright and clear in the June morning, and at the cattle moving in the grass beyond it, and at the line of the fence that he'd moved, 4 feet at a time, in the cold March mud, until it was exactly where it was supposed to be. "It's a good piece of land," he said. "It is. My grandfather picked the creek location. He looked at it. He had an eye for water. You can have the best grass in the territory, and without water, you've got nothing." He was right. Nathaniel looked at her sideways. He had something to say. She could tell by the way he was standing, slightly turned toward her, the angle that meant something was coming. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "We've been what we've been has been—" He stopped. "Started over. I'm not good at this. I know I'm not good at it." "Ask the question," she said. "I want you to be here." He said it plain, without preamble, looking at her with the directness that was the truest thing about him. Not because of the children, not because of the ranch, because of stopped, because I want you to be here, because it's different when you're here, and I don't want it to go back to what it was. He looked at the creek. It's not a very good way to say it. It's a fine way to say it, she said. I can do better, Nathaniel. She said his name, the way he'd been saying hers with weight to it. I already said yes. He looked at her when? 2 weeks ago. Table, after the withdrawal letters, I said. She stopped. You said you knew what you wanted it to be. That was a yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the almost smile that was the real one, you could have been clearer. I thought I was being perfectly clear. You were being... He shook his head. Methodical. I am methodical. I know. He looked at the creek again. I've noticed. She stood beside him in the June morning, on the property that was still theirs, and was going to stay theirs. And the creek ran the way it had run since before either of them existed. And the cattle moved in the north grass. And somewhere in the brush, a bird was singing a song she still hadn't learned the name of. I'm going to need your help, he said, this summer and after. There's more to do than I can't do all of it alone. I never could. I know, she said. That's what I'm here for. That's not the only reason you're here. No, she agreed. It's not. He reached out and took her hand. Just that, not a gesture, not a performance. Just the simple fact of it. His hand around hers. Cracked knuckle, and the broken finger healed at an angle, and the calloused palm that knew horses and fences, and the particular hardness of frozen Montana ground. She let him. She held back. They stood there for a while, at the corner of the land his grandfather had chosen for its water, in the summer that had come after the winter that had been supposed to break them, and didn't. Then Nathaniel said, the south gate needs a new hinge. I know, she said. I put it on the list. He looked at her. You have a list. I always have a list. He almost laughed, not quite, but close, the closest she'd seen him come to it in 6 months. He let go of her hand and got back on his horse, and she got on hers, and they rode back through the north gate together in the morning, that kept being warm and refused to stop being beautiful no matter how much work there was still to do. Henry and Clara were waiting at the ranch, held with cheerful incompetence by Hattie Greer, who handed Henry back to Evelyn the moment she dismounted with the expression of someone who loves babies, but is relieved when their owners return. He bit me, Hattie said. He doesn't have teeth, Evelyn said. He found a way, Hattie said. Henry in Evelyn's arms looked entirely unapologetic. Clara, in Nathaniel's, looked asleep, which was the most Clara thing she could possibly have done. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel over the heads of the twins, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything. Because nothing needed saying, the list was long, and the summer was full, and the land was solid under their feet. And all of that, every ordinary demanding piece of it, was exactly what they had, and what they'd fought for, and what they intended to keep. The south gate got its new hinge on a Saturday in late June, which meant the list was shorter by 1 item, which meant Evelyn immediately added 2 more things she'd been holding off putting on it until the more urgent items cleared. Nathaniel watched her write them down at the table that evening and said, How long is that list? Shorter than it was in January, she said. That's not an answer. The only answer that matters. He made the sound he made when she'd said something he didn't have a good response to, which was a sound she'd come to appreciate for its honesty. He went back to the harness he was mending, and she went back to the list, and the twins slept, and the summer night came in, warm through the gap under the door that she'd been meaning to fix and hadn't yet, which meant it was going on the list too. This was life on the ranch in the summer of 1887, the list, the work, the daily accounting of what had been done and what remained, conducted alongside the slow and unannounced transformation of 2 people who had started as a practical arrangement and had become something that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet, but that both of them had stopped pretending wasn't there. It was not simple. Evelyn had not expected it to be simple and would not have trusted it if it had been. There were mornings when Nathaniel was somewhere else, not physically, but in the way that grieving people, or sometimes him somewhere else, present in body and absent in the part of themselves that connects to the present moment. She'd learned to let those mornings be what they were. She didn't try to pull him back or fill the silence with noise. She just kept doing what needed doing, and eventually he'd come back, sometimes with a word, sometimes just by the way his shoulders settled, and they'd go on. There were also evenings when she sat on the porch after the twins were down and felt the particular ache of a person who has traveled very far from everything she knew and has not yet figured out whether the place she's arrived at, permanent, or just the next stop on a longer road. Those evenings she didn't talk about either. She just sat with them until they passed. The way you sit with Montana weather, you don't fight it. You just get through it. And morning usually brings something different. Henry and Clara were 8 months old at the start of July. Henry had 4 teeth and used them without discrimination. Clara had 2 teeth and used them strategically, which Evelyn thought said something about the fundamental difference in their personalities. Henry was loud and physical and opinionated about everything. Clara was quiet and observant and opinionated about specific things that she'd determined were worth caring about. They were both, in different ways, already more than Evelyn had known how to hope for in those first nights on the cot. She'd held them in the dark and felt the terrifying smallness of them. She loved them. She'd been careful not to examine this too closely in the early months, because it had felt like something that might change, might prove contingent, might be revealed as something smaller than it seemed. But it hadn't changed. It had grown in the way things grow when you stop watching them anxiously and just let them be what they are. She was their mother in the only way that mattered, not by biology, not by plan, but by presence and constancy, and the 10,000 small acts of care that accumulate over months into something that can't be named, but can be felt by anyone paying attention. Silas Mercer came to the ranch one more time. It was a Thursday morning in the second week of July, and this time he came alone. No men behind him, no performance of authority. Just a man on a horse riding up the track in the way of someone who has something specific to say and has decided to say it directly. Evelyn was in the garden when she heard him, the kitchen garden she'd started in May. Nothing ambitious, just the things she'd calculated they needed most. Potatoes, onions, beans, squash, a row of carrots she'd planted with Henry, watching from a blanket nearby with an expression of profound skepticism. Straightened up and watched him come. He pulled up at the fence. He looked at the garden, then at her. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him, though it had only been 2 months. Something about the set of his face was different, the blunt confidence still there, but with something added to it that was harder to name. She thought, studying him, that it might be a man encountering a situation that had developed in a way he hadn't been able to think his way out of, and living with the particular discomfort of that. "Mrs. Crow," he said, "Mr. Mercer, Nathaniel around? He'll be back in an hour." He nodded. He didn't move to leave. She waited. "I'll wait if that's all right," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "There's coffee," and went inside, and after a moment she heard him tie his horse and come to the porch. She brought him coffee and sat across from him on the porch steps, not because she felt hospitable, but because she felt it was important to be in the conversation, whatever conversation this turned out to be. He drank the coffee and looked at the north pasture, where the cattle were visible in the distance. "Good grass this year," he said. "Yes. North section's looking better than I've seen it in a few years. We've been rotating properly." He nodded slowly. He was working towards something. She didn't help him get there. "I want to say something," he said finally. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, and find, at the moment of delivery, to be harder than the rehearsal suggested. "About the claim, and how I handled things." She waited. "I believe the county record was the authoritative document," he said. "That's what my attorney told me." She looked at him. She kept her face still. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "The land office note said, your representative was told in October that the federal record was foundational and couldn't be reinterpreted without a federal court order." She said it without heat, just as a statement of what was true. "So that's not quite accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "Cattle in the north pasture moved in the slow, purposeful way of animals that have been given what they need and are using it. Creek caught the morning light in the way it did on clear days, silver and clean." "No," he said, "it's not quite accurate." She waited again. "I thought," he stopped. "I thought the winter would make things easier. That the situation here was—" He looked at the ranch, the barn, the garden, the cabin with its repaired walls and its straight chimney. "I underestimated what was here." "You underestimated me," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She let that sit. It was the most honest thing he'd said in any of their encounters, and she wasn't going to diminish it by moving past it quickly. "I'm not asking for the land," he said. "That's not what I came for. I know the claim is finished, and I know why it's finished." He looked at his coffee cup. "I came because," he paused. "My attorney told me to let it go and move on and not say anything further. He said anything I said could be used against me." Probably right, she said. Probably, he looked up. But I've been a neighbor to this ranch for 16 years. Whatever else I am, I've been a neighbor, and I behaved in a way that he stopped. I behaved badly, toward a family that had enough to manage without what I added to it. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about January, about the barn door shoved open, about the way he'd looked at Nathaniel and not at her, about the word mail order delivered like something disposable. She thought about the letters she'd written, and the plat that had taken 3 weeks to arrive, and the note from the land office that had said, in its bureaucratic way, that Mercer had been told and had proceeded anyway. She thought about what it would cost her to accept this, and what it would cost her not to. I appreciate you coming, she said, and I'll tell Nathaniel you came. He looked at her. That's all? What else would you like me to say? He thought about it. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted in his face, the remnant of the blunt confidence falling away briefly to show what was under it, which was just a man who had done a calculated thing and had found that calculated things have a weight that follows you. Nothing, he said. That's fair. Nathaniel came back from the south field to find them on the porch with their coffee, and the conversation that followed was not long. Nathaniel was not a man who required elaborate reconciliation. He listened to what Mercer said, asked one question, "Are we done with this?" Received yes in return, and then said, "All right," in the way he said most things that were settled. They shook hands. Mercer left. Nathaniel stood at the fence and watched him ride down the track. "Do you believe him?" Evelyn asked. "Mostly," he said. "He's not a man who apologizes easily. Coming here was something. Came because he wants to be a neighbor again," she said. "He's still going to be here in 10 years. He knows that. So does he." Nathaniel turned away from the fence. "Are you all right with that?" "I'm all right with people being what they are and trying to be better." She looked at the track, empty now. "I don't require people to be good before I'm done being angry at them." But he was honest today. That's worth something. Nathaniel looked at her with the look that still surprised her sometimes, the one that was just clear, just him looking at her without all the layers. "You're more generous than I am," he said. "I've had more practice at it," she said. "I've had to be." He reached out and touched her face. Just briefly, his thumb along her cheekbone. The way you touch something you're still not entirely sure you're allowed to touch. Then he dropped his hand and went inside to check on the twins, and she stood at the fence for another moment, in the July morning, with the creek running, and the cattle moving, and the garden doing what gardens do when they've been given water and time. They were married on a Saturday in August. It was not a large wedding. There was no way to have a large wedding when the nearest town was a full hour's ride, and both parties were people who found public ceremony somewhat excruciating. Colfax came because he was the closest thing to official presence they could manage without the circuit judge, who was not due through Harrow Creek for another 2 months. Mrs. Aldrich came because she came to everything and could not have been kept away with actual physical force. Hattie and Doss Greer came, and Hattie brought her baby, and Doss brought a bottle of something he'd made himself that was better than it had any right to be. Mrs. Pullman came. This was a surprise. She arrived on her wagon with a covered dish and a wrapped package, and took her seat on the porch with the air of a woman who has decided something and is committed to it, and she gave Evelyn a look when she arrived that was, for Mrs. Pullman, essentially an embrace. It was held outside, in the yard in front of the cabin, in the warm August afternoon, with the mountains in the distance and the creek running, and the north pasture full of cattle that had, against various odds, survived and multiplied. Henry sat in Mrs. Aldrich's arms and ate the edge of her hat. Clara sat on Hattie's hip and observed the proceedings with the focused attention of someone taking notes for later use. Colfax read from the legal text he'd brought, the civil portions that constituted a valid marriage under territorial law, and Nathaniel stood beside Evelyn in the good shirt she'd mended twice and said the words that needed to be said in the plain. Deliberate voice of a man who means what he says and knows that what he's saying matters. She said hers back. They were not eloquent vows. There was no flowery language, no poetry, nothing that would have looked well carved into anything. They were the words of two people who had spent 8 months in close quarters, learning each other's faults and capabilities and limits, and had decided, with full information, to continue. That was, Evelyn thought, better than eloquence. Afterward, Mrs. Pullman's covered dish turned out to be a beef pie of considerable quality, and Doss Greer's bottle was distributed with some care, and Mrs. Aldrich held Henry for the better part of 2 hours and seemed entirely unbothered by the hat damage. Hattie cried, which she'd announced in advance she was going to do, and which she accomplished without any apparent self-consciousness. At some point in the late afternoon, Evelyn found herself standing slightly apart, watching the small collection of people on and around the porch of the cabin that had been cold and broken when she'd arrived, and is now well. Not perfect. The gap under the door was still there. The north wall's leather patch showed if you looked at it in the right light. The garden was producing, but had a section near the east end where something was eating the carrots, and she hadn't yet figured out what. The list was still long. But the children were healthy and becoming people. The land was intact and productive. The man she'd married was inside talking to Colfax with the particular animation he had when he was talking about cattle, which was the animation he had for most things he cared about. And she could hear his voice through the window going up slightly when he made a point he thought was important. Mrs. Aldrich came and stood beside her. "Well," the older woman said. "Well," Evelyn agreed. "You look like a woman calculating something." "I'm always calculating something." Mrs. Aldrich looked at the porch. "You know what I thought when I came to the cabin in January? When I first saw you." "What?" "I thought, here's a woman who came here to survive something. Not to arrive anywhere. Just to get through." She paused. "I've been wrong about a great many things in my life, but I'm glad I was wrong about that." Evelyn looked at her. "What were you wrong about? You weren't just surviving." She said it with the simplicity of someone stating an obvious thing. "You were building the whole time. You just didn't know what you were building yet." Evelyn thought about that for a moment. "Maybe I knew," she said. "I just didn't say it." Mrs. Aldrich made the sound that meant something had been understood and didn't need more words. Then she went back to Henry, who had moved on from the hat to something else of hers that was apparently equally interesting. October came the way it always came in Montana, sudden, serious, without apology. The first-year anniversary of Ruth Crow's death fell on a Thursday in the second week of October, and Nathaniel was quiet that day in the way she'd come to understand, gone to the place he needed to go, doing the accounting that he did, holding what needed to be held. She gave him the morning. She kept the children occupied and the cabin running and the list moving, and she didn't ask anything of him. In the afternoon, she brought him coffee where he was sitting in the barn, not working, just sitting in the way you sit when you need to be somewhere that isn't the place you were. He took the coffee. She sat down on the hay bale across from him. "She'd have been good at this," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "The land claim business. She'd have been. She was clever. Sharper than she let on." He looked at the coffee. "She would have written to Helena in November, and I'd have been protected before Mercer even started." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "Definitely." He said it without bitterness, just as the fact it was. She was quick like that. "Different quick than me," Evelyn said. "Not better. Different." He looked at her. "I know that. I just want you to know that I know it too." She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to be what she was. I've never been trying to be that," he said. "I've always known that." They sat for a moment in the barn, quiet, the animals breathing around them, the hay smell and the leather smell, and the cold that was starting to mean business outside. "I miss her," he said. "I'm going to miss her, yes," Evelyn said. "That doesn't mean—" "I know what it doesn't mean," she said gently. "You don't have to explain it." He was quiet for a moment. "I hated October for a long time," he said. "I started hating it in October, and then the winter came, and I hated that too. And then you arrived." And he paused. "And it was still hard. But it was different kind of hard. Hard with something in it." "Something in it," she repeated. "Purpose, maybe. Or just he struggled, which he always did when the thing he was trying to say was more feeling than argument. Company. Someone who was also dealing with the hard part instead of just me." He looked at her. "I don't think I knew how alone I was until there was someone else here." She thought about that. About the particular loneliness of people who are too busy surviving to notice they're alone, until suddenly they aren't, and the contrast makes the previous state visible in a way it wasn't when they were inside it. She'd known that loneliness. In the boarding house, in the years after the engagement dissolved, in the 4 years of useful necessity in Jefferson City, with the novels and the legal books, and the seamstress work that paid for living, but not for anything above living. "I know," she said. "I was alone too," he looked at her. "You never talk about before. There isn't that much to say. I managed." She paused. "I'm better at after than before." Before is just where after starts. He almost smiled. That's a very you thing to say. I'm aware." He set down the coffee cup and leaned forward, with his elbows on his knees in the posture he had when he was about to say something he'd been carrying. "I want you to know," he said, "what you came into, what I asked you to do, without telling you what it would cost you. The winter, the claim, the whole—" He gestured. "I want you to know I understand what you did. You don't owe me. I'm not paying a debt, he said. I'm telling you that I see it, what it cost and what you gave anyway. He met her eyes. Some people come to something and they give what they agreed to give. And some people give past the agreement. You gave past it. He paused. Every day. From the first day, the barn was very quiet around them. Outside, the October wind was beginning to do the thing it did, testing the walls the way it tested all walls eventually. Somewhere in the south field, one of the cattle made a sound that carried. Thought about the first night. The cot, the cold, the 2 crying infants, the pot of condensed milk and water that had to last, the leather strips and the gap in the north wall, the wooden crate with the papers in the oilcloth, the letters, the plat, the stone marker in the northwest corner of the land that Mercer's lawyer had tried to make negotiable. She thought about what it had cost her. It had cost her things. Some days it had cost more than she'd expected. There had been mornings in February and March, in the bone-deep cold and the gray light and the relentless work of keeping everything alive, when she'd sat on the edge of the cot before dawn and asked herself the question that she'd forbidden herself from asking in the boarding house, whether she was in the right place, whether this was the decision she'd thought it was, whether she had, again, trusted a situation that would eventually reveal something she hadn't been told. Times that she'd asked the question. Each time she'd looked at the twins in the crate and the stove that needed feeding, and the man asleep behind the curtain who would be up in an hour and would need to eat before he went out into the cold, and she'd gotten up. Not because she was certain, because she'd decided that certainty was not a condition she was going to wait for, because the work was real and the children were real, and what was growing between her and this man was real, even when it was slow and unspoken and complicated by grief and weather and the particular difficulty of 2 people learning each other without a roadmap. I know you see it, she said. That's enough. He reached out and took her hand. She held his back. They sat there for a while in the barn on a Thursday in October, a year after the worst thing that had happened to him, and 8 months after the thing that had started changing what came after, and outside the wind was doing what it was going to do, and the winter was coming regardless, and neither of them was afraid of it. November brought the first real snow, and with it a letter from Helena confirming that the federal jurisdiction review had been formally closed following Mercer's withdrawal, the matter resolved in favor of the existing property record. Colfax sent a note along with the official correspondence saying he'd filed a copy with the county clerk for the record, which meant the whole thing, the claim, the withdrawal, the federal confirmation was now documented in 3 places and would remain so. Nathaniel read the Helena letter at the table and then folded it and put it in the wooden crate with the deed and the plat and the land office note and Mercer's withdrawal. He put the lid on the crate and put the crate back where it lived, under the shelf near the window. Is that the last of it? Evelyn asked. That's the last of it, he said. The winter of 1887 was not as hard as the winter of 1886. Nothing could have been the previous winter had been the kind that became a reference point, the one that people in that territory would talk about for years as the measure of bad. This winter was cold and long and demanding in the way that all Montana winters were cold and long and demanding, but it was manageable in a way that the previous one had not been, and Evelyn knew, with the knowledge that came from having done a thing once, how to manage it. She knew where the cold came in and how to stop it. She knew how to stretch the provisions in the way that didn't feel like deprivation. She knew the hay wall configuration that kept the barn temperature in range for the calves, and she knew which of the cattle needed watching in hard cold and which ones you didn't need to worry about. She knew the pump and its sideways pressure. She knew the stove's particular character and what it needed in the long nights. She also knew Nathaniel, his rhythms, his silences, his particular form of humor that came out sideways when he was comfortable, his stubbornness that was sometimes the most useful thing about him and sometimes the most infuriating. She knew when to push and when to wait, and when the best thing she could do was simply be in the room. Henry and Clara were 10 months old when the second winter started, and they were no longer the fragile, terrifying creatures she'd found in the wooden crate on that first January evening. Henry pulled himself to standing using anything available and moved along surfaces with the determined lateral progress of someone who had decided walking was the next problem to solve and was taking it very seriously. Clara sat and watched him with the expression of someone who had also decided to walk, but was going to do it correctly the first time rather than make a scene about it. They had personalities now, distinct and unmistakable. They had preferences and grievances, and the ability to communicate both with an efficiency that had clearly been refined over months of practice. They also had, increasingly, opinions about Nathaniel Henry in particular had developed a habit of grabbing Nathaniel's collar when being held and attempting to redirect him with the conviction of a very small foreman, which Nathaniel bore with the patient dignity of a man who had made peace with being managed by someone considerably smaller than himself. One evening in December, after the twins were down and the cabin was quiet, Nathaniel said something she hadn't expected. "I want to tell you something about Ruth." She looked up from the mending. "She was pregnant," he said, "when we knew the twins were coming. She told me she was afraid." He looked at the fire. "Not about the birth exactly. She'd been through things before. She wasn't someone who frightened easily. She was afraid that she wouldn't be enough, that two at once was more than one person could love properly." He paused. "She said that to me one night, about 2 months before." Evelyn set down the mending. "I didn't know what to say to her," he said. "I told her she was the most capable woman I knew and she'd be fine." He looked at his hands, which was true, but it wasn't what she was asking. What was she asking? She was asking me to tell her that loving two at once wouldn't divide the love. That it would double it, maybe. Or just be different. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't have the words for it then. Evelyn looked at the crate where the twins slept. At Henry, who was on his back, with his arms flung wide in the total physical abandon of a sleeping baby who has not yet learned to conserve space. At Clara, who was curled precisely on her side, as if even in sleep she was organized. "She was right," Evelyn said. "It doesn't divide." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." She picked up the mending again. The fire settled. Outside, the December snow was doing what December snow did, which was everything it could to make the world smaller and harder and more insistent. And inside the cabin, the stove held against it, and the walls held against it, and the family inside the walls held against it too. Each in their own way, imperfectly and adequately, which is the only way anything holds. Spring came to Blackthorn Ridge for the second time since Evelyn's arrival on the 1st of March. Technically, though March in Montana rarely reads the calendar, and the actual spring the kind with warmth in it, with mud giving way to solid ground, with the creek running bright and the south-facing slopes going green, arrived in mid-April, the way it always did, the way Ruth had always said it would. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the cabin on the first morning that was genuinely warm. Not warm by any southern measure, not warm by the standards of the city she'd come from, but warm by Montana standards, which meant you could stand outside without immediately needing to go back inside. And the sun on your face was doing something that qualified as heat rather than just light. Henry was standing beside her, holding the doorframe with both hands. He'd learned to walk in February, on a Tuesday, with the total focus of someone completing a project, and had not slowed down since. He was holding the doorframe now not because he needed to, she thought, but because he was deciding whether the outside the investment of his current resources. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. "Spring," she said. He said something back that had the cadence of a word, but none of the consonants yet. "Close enough," she said. She heard Nathaniel behind her, coming from the direction of the barn, with the morning in his boots, and she heard him pause when he reached the porch, the way he paused when he was taking stock of something. "The creek's running clear," he said. "I know, I could hear it change last night. North Pasture's going to be ready in 3 weeks. Maybe 2, I figured," she said. "I started the rotation schedule last night. It's on the table." He was quiet for a moment. "Then of course it is." There was something in how he said it, not surprise anymore, not the recalibration of a man encountering something unexpected. Just the particular tone of someone noting a fact about the landscape they live in, the way you note that the creek runs clear in April, or the North Pasture greens up in May. A fact that has become part of how things are. She was part of how things were. That was, she thought, the simplest and truest way to say what had happened over the course of a year and a winter and another spring. She had arrived as a solution to a problem and had become part of the texture of the place itself. Not Ruth, and never trying to be. Someone new who had come in through the gap that grief had left open, and had not tried to close it, but had stood beside it and built something alongside it. That is the thing that is hardest to explain about this kind of life, and this kind of love, and this kind of starting over. People talk about it as replacement, as if one thing ends and another begins, clean, like turning a page. But it isn't like that. Nothing gets replaced. Things accumulate. The grief stays. It just stops being the only thing in the room. The absence stays. You learn to move around it. The way you learn to move around furniture in a house you've lived in long enough that you stop noticing it's there. What Evelyn had brought to Blackthorn Ridge was not a replacement for what had been there before. It was the thing that came after, which is always different from the thing that came before, and always shaped by it, and never quite separate from it. She knew that. She'd made her peace with it in February, sitting on the edge of the cot before dawn, asking herself the hard question and deciding to get up anyway. Some decisions you make once and they hold. Some decisions you make every morning quietly, before anyone else is awake, and hold them yourself because they're yours to hold, and no one else is going to hold them for you. She'd made this one every morning for a year. She intended to keep making it. Henry let go of the doorframe and walked out onto the porch with the slightly aggressive confidence of a person who has recently mastered a skill and is still in the phase of applying it everywhere. He made it to the edge of the porch, looked down at the step, assessed the situation, and sat down deliberately before the situation could assess him. Clara appeared at the doorway behind them, having climbed out of the crate again in the way she'd been doing for 3 weeks that Evelyn still hadn't figured out how to prevent. She looked at Henry on the porch. She looked at the spring morning beyond him. She looked at Evelyn. Then she walked to the porch edge, stepped down the step without pausing, and continued into the yard. "She's been walking for 2 days," Nathaniel said from behind Evelyn, with the tone of a man who has been sitting on information. "I know," Evelyn said. "I've been waiting to see when she'd tell you." He came to stand beside her in the doorway, and they watched Henry scramble down the step in pursuit of his sister, and they watched Clara continue across the yard with the unhurried purpose of someone who had decided where she was going, and didn't particularly need company on the way there. The mountains in the distance were still white at the top. Creek was running. The north pasture was beginning, just barely, at its south edge, to show the first green of what was coming. Stone marker at the northwest corner of the land sat exactly where it had always sat, exactly where the 1,869 survey said it was, exactly where it was going to stay. There would be more winters. There would be more lists, more work, more of the grinding daily labor of keeping a thing alive in a landscape that required it. There would be more letters to write and problems to solve, and mornings when the answer was not obvious, and the only thing to do was get up and start finding it. There would also be this: the porch in the April morning. The twins in the yard conducting their separate investigations of spring. The man beside her who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to let someone stand close enough to matter. The woman who had come 800 miles on thin paper and $43, and the conviction that usefulness was enough to start with, and had found that it was, and that what grew past it, given time and weather, and the particular education of a Montana winter, was something she hadn't had the language for in St. Louis, but that she had the language for now. It was home. It had become home, not because it had been given to her, but because she had built it, day by day, in the only way that home can be built, by staying, when the staying is hard, and by bringing what you have to what's needed, and by trusting that the thing you're building is worth the building, even before you can see what it's going to be. Henry sat down in the yard and looked at the sky with the absolute attention he brought to anything that interested him. Clara turned around, looked at him, and walked back and sat down next to him. They sat there together in the April morning, looking at whatever Henry had found worth looking at, and Evelyn watched them from the porch of the cabin that was not perfect and was not finished and was entirely, completely, exactly what she had.